Have you ever fed a stranger at your table and felt, somewhere beneath the ordinary business of passing bread and filling a cup, that the act of feeding was doing something you did not intend? Not generosity going out of you, but something coming in, as though the hunger at your table were not only in the body of the person you had invited, but in the walls of the room itself, in the grain of the wood and the stone of the hearth, and that what you had really done, by opening the door and setting down the plate, was to make an agreement you had not yet read. Have you ever watched someone eat at your table and understood, very slowly across the course of a long meal, that they were not eating the food? There is a hollow in the western reach of Harlan County, Kentucky, where they still do not leave food on the table after dark. Not covered, not locked away. Gone. Off the table, off the boards, out of the room, before the sun is down. The oldest people there will tell you it is habit. They will tell you, their mothers did it, and their mothers' mothers did it, and they do not know why. But if you ask the right person, on the right evening, when the dark is coming down the ridge and the fire has burned to red, and there is nobody else in the room, they will lean forward and they will say one name to you, Sowell. And then they will say, it is a long story. I am going to tell you the long version. Settle in. Get comfortable. Get warm. Get something to eat, if you are hungry, and eat it before we go too far, because by the time we are done tonight, you may not want to eat at a table in the dark. This is the story of the Sowell family of Trace Creek Hollow, Harlan County, Kentucky. It begins in the winter of 1877, which is how they reckon it, though the thing that started in that winter had roots that went down into the ground of that hollow considerably longer than anyone in the family understood at the time. It ends in 1921, when a woman named Leora Sowell, the last of that line to live in the hollow, packed what she could carry in a flour sack and walked out of that place on a February morning without looking back, and never told her children why, only that the house had been given away. That is her word for it, found in a letter she wrote to her sister in 1944, when her sister asked, after all those years, what had really happened. The house was given away. That is all she would say. Between those two dates there are 44 years, 4 generations of a family, and a record that should not exist but does, assembled from a county death book, 3 church ledgers, 1 family Bible with notations in 4 different hands, a statement given to a circuit-riding minister in 1883, a schoolteacher's diary from 1891 to 1897, and a set of 17 letters written by a woman named Cora Sowell between 1902 and 1919. I am going to tell you what is in all of them. Everything I say comes out of one of those sources, or out of the land records and court files of Harlan County, Kentucky, which are held in the basement of the courthouse in Harlan and which I have spent considerable time in. When I am speculating, I will say so. When 2 sources disagree, I will tell you both versions and let you sit with the difference, because in a case like this, the disagreements are not problems to be smoothed over. The disagreements are the case. Let me give you the place first, before I go on. If this is the kind of case you would want 10 of, and not 1, there is a collection. It is called What the Table Remembers. 12 cases, 6 states, 1841 to 1963. Every one of them a house where something was fed until it did not need feeding anymore, and every one of them closed out by a county record with the wrong word in the box. 10 hours of these, one after the next, to sit with in the dark. The link is down in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. And before I go on, tell me where you are watching this from tonight. Put it in the comments. Just the town, the county, the country. I want to see how far this one reaches. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. It is free, and it means the next one finds you on the next night you cannot sleep. Now then, here is the place. Harlan County sits in the far southeastern corner of Kentucky, pushed up against the Virginia line, in the last fold of the Cumberland Mountains before they run out of room. It is coal country now, and was timber country then, and before that it was hunting ground, that 3 nations of people had kept deliberately empty of settlement for a very long time, not because there was nothing there worth settling on, but because there was something there that made settlement unwise. The old accounts use different words for it. The Cherokee had a word. The Shawnee had a different word. The first white settlers who came up the Cumberland River Road in the 1790s had no word for it at all, only a feeling that the ground in certain hollows was looking back at them, and most of them moved on. The ones who stayed built in the open, on the ridges, on the valley floor along the rivers, where the light came in even and all day. They built their churches on high ground. They left the deep hollows alone. But people came. They always come. Land is land, and hunger has no long memory for warnings. And by 1860, the deep hollows of Harlan County had families in them. And by 1870, most of those families had been there long enough to have stopped asking why their grandparents had chosen the high ground instead. Trace Creek Hollow runs northeast off the main stem of Clover Fork for about 2.5 miles before it closes at the headwall. It is narrow, no more than 200 yards wide at the mouth, and pinching down to perhaps 80 at the back, with walls that go up steep enough that the sun only hits the floor of it directly for about 4 hours in midsummer, and in December not at all. The creek that runs through it, Trace Creek, comes out of the headwall over a shelf of sandstone and runs down the middle of the hollow in a channel it cut a long time ago. And it is cold even in August, cold enough to ache your hand, cold enough that the cress growing along its banks stays green in winter when everything else is gray. There is a spring on the east wall of the hollow, about 3/4 of a mile in. It seeps out of a crack in the rock at about 4 feet off the ground and runs down the face in a dark stain and collects in a stone basin that somebody cut before the county existed. That basin is the reason the Sowells built where they built, because a spring at 4 feet is a spring you do not have to dig for, and a spring that has been there long enough for someone to cut a basin is a spring that has never gone dry. I want you to remember that spring. It comes back in this story several times, and each time it comes back, what is in the basin is different from what should be there. The Sowell family arrived in Trace Creek Hollow in the spring of 1851. The head of the family was a man named Gideon Sowell, 43 years old, born in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, son of a tanner who had come up from the Carolinas a generation before. He was a large, deliberate, God-fearing man who had made a decision to follow a cousin's report of good bottomland in Kentucky and had gotten, instead, 2.5 miles of shadowed hollow with 70-some acres of flat ground at the base of a headwall. He was not a man who turned around. He built. His wife was a woman named Patience Sowell, née Combs, 39 years old, born in Letcher County, which is the next county over, which meant she was mountain-born and knew what a hollow meant and said so. She said so more than once, according to the family Bible, which contains not only the births and deaths of the Sowell line, but a set of marginal notations in a woman's hand that are not scripture and are not exactly history, but are something between the two, written across 50 years in the same careful hand, growing smaller and closer as it went, as though the writer were trying to fit more truth into the same amount of space. The first notation, in the margin beside the record of Gideon Sowell's death in 1863, reads that he should have listened the first winter. I will tell you what happened the first winter in a moment, but I want to give you the rest of the family first, because you need to know who is in this house before the first winter comes. Gideon and Patience Sowell had 6 children. The first, a boy named Elam, was 21 when they came to the hollow. The second, a girl named Dorcas, was 18. The third, a boy named Luther, was 15. The fourth, a girl named Sula, was 11. The fifth, a boy named Reuben, was 7. And the sixth, The youngest was a girl named Willa, who was 3 years old in the spring of 1851, and who is, in a way I will explain, the most important person in this entire account, though she was too small when it started to understand what she was part of, and had died long before anyone else understood it either. 6 children, ranging from 3 to 21, one father, one mother. 2.5 miles up a dark hollow in the spring of 1851, and a spring in the east wall that somebody had already cut a basin for. Gideon built the cabin that summer, and into the fall. It was a log house, 1 room and a loft, set on the flat ground about 30 feet from the east wall, which put it perhaps 40 feet from the spring. He built it that close to the spring on purpose, because water, and he built it that close to the wall on purpose, because wind. Mountain logic. The wall broke the northwest wind, and the spring was right there. He finished the main walls in August, got the roof on in September, and chinked the gaps with clay and moss through October. The children cleared ground for a garden. Elam, the oldest boy, was already logging on the Clover Fork for a timber outfit that had come into the county that year, walking out every Monday morning and walking back every Saturday night, which meant that most of the work of finishing the place fell to Luther, who was 15 and capable, and to Patience, who was always capable. By the 1st of November they were in, and by the middle of November the hollow was closed in for winter. And here is where the first winter begins, and here is what Patience Saul meant by that marginal notation, and here is the thing that a careful man who was not given to turning around should have listened to. It was Reuben who told it. In the statement to the circuit minister in 1883, Reuben was 7 years old in the first winter. He was 39 when he gave the statement, and he gave it in the careful, plain language of a man who has decided to say a thing straight because he is tired of carrying it. He said, "In the first week of December, 1851, my mother put a plate of food outside the door, not on the step, not on the porch. Outside the door, set down on the ground, 3 feet from the threshold, covered with a cloth. Reuben asked her why, the way a 7-year-old asks why about everything, and she told him it was for the poor. He accepted that, because it was the kind of thing adults said, and children did not question. But he noticed that she did it again the next night, and the night after that, and that she always did it after dark, and always covered it with the same cloth, and always went out for the plate in the morning herself, before anyone else was up, and that she never said what she found on it, whether it was empty or full or touched at all. He said, she did it every night that winter, every night until the snow went. He said, my father did not know, I am sure of that. She did it after he was asleep. I saw her go out 2 times when I was supposed to be asleep in the loft, and both times she went quiet, with no lamp, and she was out no more than a minute, and she came back in, and put the bar on the door, and went to bed as if nothing. He said, in the spring, when she put the garden in, I saw her take the clay off the window that faces the spring and put fresh clay in, thicker, like she was making it harder to see through. And then he said the thing that the minister wrote down with, according to his own notation, a hand that he had to steady on the page. He said, the spring was right. I mean, what came out of it was right, the color and the temperature. But when I was 8, 9 years old, I used to put my ear against the wall of the house, the east wall, the one closest to the spring, and I could hear something I cannot describe to you as anything other than the sound of something very large being very still, not sleeping still, waiting still, the way a dog waits at a rabbit hole, patient, just patient. And I never told my father because I did not have words for it, and because I was afraid of being told I was foolish. And now I am 39 years old, and I am telling a minister of God instead of a doctor, because a doctor would say, foolish, and you might not. The minister wrote, I did not say foolish. I wrote it down instead. That is the first winter. That is where this starts. Now, I am going to tell you something about what Patience Sowell knew, because she clearly knew something, and the question of how she knew it is the question underneath all of this, the question that does not get answered until we find the letter in the church ledger in 1881, and when we find it, it changes the shape of everything that came before. But not yet. I am going to make you wait on that, because Patience waited on it in that hollow for 30 years, and it seems right to give you some of that waiting. Gideon Sowell died in the spring of 1863, 12 years after he built that house, of a chest wound taken at the Battle of Stones River the previous December. He did not die at Stones River. He died of it in March, at home, in his own bed, which was a mercy of the particular kind that leaves the person who witnesses it worse off than a clean death would have. He had come home in January, unable to breathe full and getting worse, and Patience kept him 3 months before he went. He was 55 years old. He had lived in Trace Creek Hollow for 12 years, and in those 12 years he had never once, according to every account that survives him, shown any sign that he understood what his wife was doing at the door every night in winter, or why the east wall of his own house was the thickest wall in it, or why his youngest child, Willa, who had grown from 3 to 15 in that hollow, would not go to the spring alone. Patience outlived him by 22 years. She died in 1885, in the same house, in the same bed, at 73 years old. She kept the notations in the family Bible until about a year before her death, when her handwriting went too small to read without a glass. The last notation is dated October 1884 and reads only, "20 miles is not far enough." I have been wrong about that all my life. I do not know what she meant. I have thought about it for a long time, and I do not know. And that is the kind of sentence that sits in a person. But here is what I can tell you about the 12 years Gideon was alive in that hollow, which is not nothing. The garden did well. That is the first fact. In a hollow that got 4 hours of direct sun in summer and none in winter, on ground that had never been broken before, the Sowell garden did well from the first year. Better than well. Reuben says in his statement that his mother attributed it to the spring water which they used on the garden, and that she was very particular about using that spring water and no other, drawing it herself in a particular clay jar, and that she told the children the jar was for the garden and they were not to drink from it. Reuben says he did drink from it once, when he was about 10, on a hot day when it was the nearest water, and that it tasted wrong. He said, "It tasted the way old copper smells," and my tongue went numb, and I did not do it again. The animals did less well. The Sowell's animals, from the beginning, did not thrive in Trace Creek Hollow. Not the chickens, not the pigs, not the 2 milk cows they brought in the first year. The animals were not sick in any way a person could name. They just diminished. They ate, and they did not fill out. They were thin, and they were quiet. Quieter than animals ought to be, and they gave less milk and laid fewer eggs and put on less weight than their feed accounted for. Gideon noted it in a farm log that survived to 1902, when Cora Sowell found it in the loft and transcribed parts of it into her letters. He wrote, in the fall of 1853, that the stock wants for nothing he can name and lacks for something he cannot. He had increased the feed, no improvement. Patience says, leave it. Patience says, leave it. That is the kind of entry a man makes when he has had an argument and lost it, and is writing down the loss for his own record. He wrote a similar entry in the fall of 1857 and again in the spring of 1860, and each time Patience says, leave it. What Patience was leaving, and why she was leaving it, and what she knew that Gideon did not, is the question I promised you the answer to, and the answer comes from the church ledger of the Clover Fork Baptist Church, which still exists, which I have held, which is stored in a tin box in a woman's hall closet in Harlan, and which she let me spend 2 afternoons with. The Clover Fork Baptist Church was the Sowells congregation. They walked out of the hollow every Sunday, except in the worst of winter, 3 miles down the Clover Fork Road to the church. Patience Sowell was a pillar of that congregation for 30 years. She taught Sunday school. She cleaned the building. She did the flowers for the weddings and laid out the dead for the funerals. And in the summer of 1861, 10 years after she came to the hollow, she wrote a letter to the minister of that church, a man named Elbert Frazier, and she gave it to him in person, and she asked him to read it privately, and she asked him to keep it. And she said she would tell him in person whether to burn it or preserve it, and that if she died without telling him, he should preserve it. She died in 1885. She never told him to burn it. He preserved it. When he died in 1893, the letter was in the church ledger, tucked into the back, under the membership rolls for 1863. It stayed there through 3 more ministers and 80 years until I found it. The letter is 4 pages, in Patience Sowell's same careful hand. I am going to read you all of it that matters. She begins with an apology for troubling him, and she says she has thought about writing for 10 years and has decided she must, because she is not certain she will always know enough to write it plainly, and she would rather write it while her mind is clear and her reasons are clear, and she can still be accountable for what she says. She says, I need to tell you what my grandmother told me, and what her mother told her, and what I believe to be true from my own experience, which is now 10 years long in this place. She says, my grandmother was a woman named Harney Combs, who was born in Letcher County in 1778 and died there in 1844. Her mother before her was named Poll Combs, and Poll Combs was one of the first white women in Letcher County, coming there from North Carolina with her husband in the 1790s. And Poll Combs told my grandmother, and my grandmother told my mother, and my mother told me on the night before I was married, as a gift as she thought of it, though I have thought about whether it was a gift ever since. And here is what she told me, and what I know to be true. She says, there are places in these mountains where the ground is hungry. Not the way ground is usually hungry, the way it eats the dead and makes them soil. A different hunger, a patient one. These places were known to the people who were here before us, and the reason they were known is that those people had learned, at great cost, not to stay in them long. They came to hunt, and came to gather, and came to pray in certain of these places, but they did not build there, and they did not eat there, and they did not say their own names there out loud. And the reason for all of those rules is the same reason, and it is this. She says, the hungry places feed on what is offered freely. On the food set out, the prayer said aloud, the name given in good faith. Not taken, never taken. That is the rule of it. It will not take. It will only receive. But what is given freely, in one of these places, becomes the ground's, and the ground, once it has tasted what you have given, will want more of the same kind. And if you have given food, it will come to your table, and it will sit there and eat, and it will look like whoever you fed it with, and it will be, to any eye, ordinary. She says, my mother told me this on the night before my wedding, as a warning and as a guide, and the guide is this: never feed a stranger in a hungry place. Eat nothing that grows in one. And if something comes to your table that you did not invite, and it eats, and you let it eat, and it finishes, you have made the second offering, and after the second offering it does not leave. She says, I knew this when I came to Trace Creek Hollow. I knew what the spring meant, and I knew what the hollow meant. My husband did not know, and I could not tell him, because the knowing was given to the women of my line, daughter to mother, and I could not give it to a man without giving it wrong, and a wrong telling is worse than no telling. She says, and so I have fed it, every winter, the way my mother's line has fed such things for as long as the line goes back, because the feeding is the oldest agreement. You feed it, and in return it feeds your ground, and it does not come to your table. You keep it outside, and it keeps outside. And for 10 years this is held. She says, I am writing to you now because I need a witness who will outlast me, and because I am not certain any longer that I have not made a mistake, and the nature of the mistake I may have made is this. My husband built closer to the spring than I told him to. I said 30 feet would hold it. I am no longer certain 30 feet holds it. Last winter, in January, I found the cloth on the plate folded inside the door. She says, I put it outside the door. I always put it outside the door. In January, I found the cloth folded inside the door on the floor of my own kitchen, and the plate was clean, and the door was barred, and I had barred it myself. She says, I do not know if this means it has come inside, or only that it is telling me it could. I do not know which of those is worse. I am keeping the feeding the same. I am keeping the clay thick on the east window. I am not telling my children more than I have to. But I am telling you, in case I am wrong about the 30 feet, in case the line is not enough, and I am asking you to pray over this letter, and keep it, because a thing that has been witnessed by a man of God is harder to lose than a thing that only a woman knows. That is the end of the part that matters. That is what Patient Soul wrote in 1861, 10 years in, a year and a half before her husband died. Sit with that for a moment, because I want you to feel the full weight of what this woman was doing. She came to a hollow she recognized as dangerous. She did not turn around, because you do not tell a man like Gideon Sowell to turn around. She made the oldest agreement she knew how to make. She fed the thing every winter, every night, in the dark, after her husband was asleep, for 30 years, to keep it outside and keep it small and keep it fed enough that it did not come to the table. For 30 years she managed it alone. She made the garden work. She let the animals be thin. She kept the east wall thick. She kept the children back from the spring. She wrote one letter to one minister and gave it to him in person, and told him to preserve it. And then she went back to the hollow, and she kept feeding for 30 more years. And the question that sits at the center of this whole case, the question that everything else is trying to answer, is this. Was she wrong about the 30 feet before she wrote the letter? Or was she wrong after? Because the cloth folded inside the door might be a first crossing, or it might be a message. And those are not the same thing. And which one it was determines everything that came after, and no one in that family knew the answer until it was too late to use it. Now, let me give you the generation that came after Gideon, because the story does not become fully visible until we are in the next generation, which is the generation of Reuben and Willa, and then the generation after that, which is where the real damage begins. Elam Sowell, the oldest son, left Trace Creek Hollow in 1858, married a woman in Whitley County, and did not come back. He gets one sentence in this account because he had the sense to go, and in a story full of people who stayed when they should have left, a person who left deserves a kind of silence that passes for respect. Dorcas married a man named Goines in 1855 and went to Bell County, and also does not come back, though she comes back in the letter writing, and one of her granddaughters will matter to us later. Luther stayed. Luther is the one you need to watch. Luther Sowell was born in 1836 in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, and he was 15 when the family came to the Hollow, and he was the one who did the building alongside his father, and he was the one who knew the Hollow the way a boy who has worked every inch of ground knows it, bone deep, without having thought about what the knowing means. He was the one who rechinked the east wall in the fall of 1854 thicker on his mother's instruction, without asking why. He was the one who cut the new clay for the east window in 1857. He was the one who, in 1863, when his father was dying, took over the farm log and began keeping it in his own hand. He married a woman named Bess Fry in 1866, 3 years after his father died, and she came to live in the Hollow, and she is the first person in this account who came in from outside without being born to it, and she is the first person in this account who left a record in her own hand of what it felt like to come to that spring for the first time. Her record is the schoolteacher's diary, which I will explain when we get to it. She did not write it herself. She told it to a schoolteacher named Ottoline Pratt, who was in the Hollow from 1891 to 1897, and who wrote everything down, and who died in 1943, having never said a word of it to anybody but the paper. What Bess Fry said about coming to Trace Creek Hollow for the first time, as Ottoline recorded it, was this. She said, "It was a June day, warm. She and Luther had been married at the Clover Fork Church that morning, and they walked in from the Clover Fork Road together. The hollow was green, as hollows are in June, and the creek was running full, and Luther showed her the garden and the house and the spring, and she put her hand in the spring basin to feel the water. She said, the water was the right temperature. Everything about it was right, the color, the clearness, the feel of it. But when she took her hand out, the water stayed. That is how she said it. And Ottoline wrote it down the same way. She said, I put my hand in and took my hand out, and the water stayed around where my hand had been, like a mold, like there was still a hand in it, and I watched it for a full minute before it smoothed back over, and I never put my hand in that spring again. Luther saw her watching it and said nothing. He had seen it himself many times. He was 19 years old the first time he saw it, working at the east wall, and he had decided what his father had decided and what, in a different way, his mother had decided differently, which is that some things you decide not to know, and the decision holds you up better than the knowing would. He was, in that way, his father's son rather than his mother's, and the decision cost him accordingly. Now, Reuben Sowell, the fifth child, who gave the statement in 1883, he stayed in the Hollow until 1868, when he was 24, and then he left and went to work in the coal mines at Cranks Creek, and then the lead mines in Missouri, and then came back to Harlan County in 1878, and settled in Evarts, 4 miles from the mouth of Clover Fork. He never went back into the Hollow. He said in his statement that he went back once, in the fall of 1870, to help Luther with a fence, and he walked in and helped with the fence, and walked back out the same day, and had not been back in 12 years, and did not intend to go. Not because I am afraid of the dark or the hollow or the quiet, because I know what I heard in that east wall. And I know that Luther has built onto the house, and the addition is against the east wall, and a man who puts a room against that wall either does not know what is in it or has made a peace with it that I am not willing to make. Luther had built on in 1865, the year after his father died, a second room against the east wall, which is where the spring was, which is where his mother had kept the clay thickest and the window smallest. He put a full room there, with a fireplace, with windows that faced the spring from 8 feet instead of 40. Patience Sowell's marginal notation for that year reads that he will not be told. Lord, he will not be told. And then, below that, in slightly smaller letters, I have moved the feeding to the spring itself. I do not know if that helps. I do not know if that helps. That is the sentence of a woman who has maintained a system for 14 years and is watching the system be changed around her by a man who does not know the system exists. She moved the feeding from the door to the spring. She was trying to redirect the agreement, to keep the thing oriented outward toward its own source. She was, in her way, doing systems management on something she had only ever been given half instructions for. The question is, whether it worked. And the answer depends on which year you are looking at. In 1866, the year Bess arrived, it seems to have held. In 1868, the year Reuben left, it seems to have held. In 1870, the year Reuben came back for one day to help with the fence and walked out and never came back. It seems to have been holding, or Reuben might not have been able to leave. But in the winter of 1877, something changed. And here is where the case truly begins. And here is where I am going to ask you to hold two things at once, because the events of the winter of 1877 are told to us from two directions, and the two directions do not fully agree, and I think both of them are telling the truth about different parts of the same thing. The first direction is Luther's farm log, as transcribed by Cora Sowell in 1902. The second direction is the family Bible, in the notations Patience made in the margins, which by 1877 had gotten smaller and closer and harder to read. Luther's farm log for December 1877 begins normally. Accounts of woodcut, of a cow that was off her feed, of a repair to the roof of the second room. Then, on the 12th of December, 1877, this entry, he writes, "A man came to the door this evening after dark. Did not know him. He was cold, and he said he was turned around in the dark, coming from the Clover Fork Road, and had seen our light. Bess fed him at the table. I gave him the barn for the night." That is the whole entry for December 12th. On December 13th, he writes, "Man in the barn this morning, still there. Said he would be glad to work for his keep another day. I said all right. He helped me with the fence post on the north end. He is a big man and useful. Does not say much." December 14th. "Man still here. Did not ask to stay. Just did not leave. Bess fed him again at supper. I begin to think he means to winter here. Have not told him to go. The work is useful and the winter is hard, and I have no reason to turn a man out into the cold." December 15th. No entry. December 16th. "Man's name is Creel, or that is what he says. He has moved from the barn to the second room, and he did it himself, carried his roll from the barn to the room, and when I went to say something about it, he was already in, and he looked at me in a way I did not know what to do with, and I let it go. Bess says, leave it. So I leave it. Bess says, leave it. Those three words, they echo out of the past at you like something dropped in a well. December 17th. Creel cut the wood without being asked, all of it, 3 days' worth, and stacked it right. He is a very large man when you see him in daylight. His shadow seems to be on the wrong side of him sometimes, and I have thought about that and decided I am tired, and it is December 18th. I have tried to remember what Creel looks like, and I find I cannot hold it. I sat across the table from him at supper, and I looked at his face the whole time. Bess was talking, and I cannot tell you now what color his eyes are, or whether his jaw is narrow or wide, or how old he is. Every time I look back at the memory of it, the face has shifted. I told Bess this, and she said she had noticed the same thing, and she said she thought it was the light in the second room, which is poor because the window is small. That may be it. That is Luther's record for the first week. Now let me give you Patience's. On the same page of the family Bible where she records Luther and Bess's son Calhoun being born in November of that year, which is 6 weeks before the man in the door, Patience wrote in the margin, in the smallest hand yet, she wrote, "It has come inside. I do not know when. I have moved the feeding 3 times. It does not go to the feeding any more. It is inside the house, and it is in the second room, and it looks like a man, and Luther fed it at his table, and it ate." And below that, Bess does not know. Luther does not know. I have told the child to stay in the front room. I will not write what I am afraid of next. She did not write what she was afraid of next. She was 75 years old in the winter of 1877. She was sleeping in the front room by then, in a corner bed, because the stairs to the loft had gotten past her. She was, by every account, still herself and clear. sharp and clear and unmistaken about ordinary things. And she wrote that sentence, that last sentence, in the margin beside her grandchild's birth record, and then she stopped. The margin is blank after that, for 2 months. Here is what I need you to understand about what Luther Sowell did, and what he did not do, and why the distinction matters so much that the whole thing turns on it. He did not invite the man called Creel. That is important. He did not go to the door with a lamp and call out, "Come in! You are welcome at my table." What happened was ordinary mountain hospitality in the way that ordinary mountain hospitality worked in 1877 in a hard winter in a hollow 2.5 miles from the nearest neighbor. A cold man came to the door. A woman fed him. A farmer gave him the barn. That is not an invitation. That is decency. But Patience Sowell knew, and had written in her letter to the minister in 1861, and had been given the knowledge by the women of her line, going back to Pole Combs in the 1790s, that the thing in a hungry place does not take, it only receives. And what is given freely, in good faith, at the table, becomes the grounds. And after the second offering, it does not leave. Bess fed him at the table on the 12th. Luther gave him the barn. On the 13th, Bess fed him again. That is the second offering. And on the 14th, the man called Creel did not leave. The agreement was old. The agreement was older than the Sowell family and older than the county. And the Sowells had been keeping it for 26 years, in the form Patience understood it, feeding the thing outside and keeping it there, keeping the east wall thick and the window small, and the agreement in place. But Luther broke the east wall open when he built the second room, and Bess did not know about the feeding. And there was a new baby in the house, born 6 weeks before, a boy named Calhoun, and the thing in the hollow had been patient for 26 years, which, in the life of a thing that is only patient, is nothing at all. So it walked to the door, and Bess opened it, and it ate. Now, I have to tell you about the man called Creel, because he was in that house for 2 months, and the people in the house with him left records of what that was like. And the records are among the strangest documents I have ever read, because they describe, in the plain language of people who have decided to be sane about something insane, the experience of living with something that is nearly a person, but not. Luther's farm log for the second week of Creel's presence, which is the third week of December 1877, December 21st. Creel has taken to rising before I do. I rise at 5 and he is up and about already, in the second room or outside, and I can never catch him rising. He is simply up when I am up. This morning I heard him go to the spring before first light. I did not look. December 22nd. We killed the hog today. Creel helped. He is strong as a mule, and he does not mind the blood. He said almost nothing all morning. At the end of it, he asked if he could have the blood for himself, meaning the blood that runs off in the killing, which ordinarily goes to waste or to the dogs. I said yes. I do not know why I said yes. I said it before I thought about it. He took it in a bucket to the second room. December 23rd. I did not sleep well. Something I ate, maybe. At 2 or 3 in the morning I heard Creel in the second room, and the sound he was making was not sleeping and not moving about. It was, as near as I can describe it, the sound of something filling up. December 24th. Christmas Eve. Bess made a good supper. Creel sat at the table and ate everything that was put in front of him, and then more. I have noticed that he eats a great deal and never appears to be full, and that after he eats he does not look any different than before, which is to say, he does not look satisfied. He looks the same after eating as before, like the eating does not arrive anywhere. I want you to stop on that sentence. Like the eating does not arrive anywhere. Luther Sowell was not an educated man. He had a Bible, a farm log, and 40 years in a hollow. and he sat across a table from something that ate and ate and ate and watched it eat, and he found the right words for what he was seeing, and the right words are among the most troubling I have ever read in a primary source. December 26th. I asked Creel where he had come from. He said, "Over the ridge." I said, "From where, specifically?" He said he could not say specifically. I said, "Where was he going?" He said he had not decided. I said he was welcome as long as he was useful. He said he intended to be useful for a good while. He said it like a man who has already decided how long a good while is. I did not like the way he said it, but I do not know how to explain what I did not like about it. The words were right. The words were the right words for a man to say. The feeling behind the words was wrong in a way I am writing down because I do not want to forget that I noticed it. December 28th. Mother is not well. She has not been out of her corner bed in 3 days. She will not say what is wrong. She looks at the door of the second room the way you look at a fire that you are not sure is out. December 29th. I went in to see Mother tonight after supper. She took my hand and she said to me, "Luther, what does he smell like?" I said I did not understand her. She said, "When he comes close to you, what does he smell like?" And I thought about it, and I told her, "Nothing. He does not smell like anything." And she closed her eyes and she said, "All right." And she held my hand for a while. And then she said, "Do not let him near the baby." And I said, I had not. And she said, "Good." She said, "That is the one thing. Keep him away from the baby." And I said I would. And she seemed to rest easier after that, though she would not say anything more. Nothing. He does not smell like anything. A large man who eats enormously and smells of nothing. Who rises before you, but you never hear him rise. Who helps with the work without being asked. Whose face you cannot hold in your memory. Who stays and stays and stays. Luther Sowell kept writing. Through January of 1878, through February. The log is not daily in this period. Some days are skipped, some have only a line. But the picture that assembles from it across those 2 months is the picture of a man who has understood, at some level below the level of naming, what is in his second room, and who has decided that the knowing is less dangerous than the saying. January 8th. Creel does not use the outhouse. I have noticed this. He goes out in the night and comes back, and he never goes to the outhouse. I have checked. In a fresh snow on the 6th, I checked his tracks. He went to the spring and came back, just the spring and back. I did not say anything about it. January 19th. Bess asked me at breakfast, "Has Creel been sick?" I said, "Not that I know of." She said, "It is only that he never looks worse or better. That since he came he has been exactly the same. His beard does not grow, his clothes do not wear. He is always exactly the same as he was the first night," which she said she knows is strange because she cannot remember what he looked like the first night. But she is sure he looks the same. I told her she was tired and it was January. She said, "I know it is January. That is why I am telling you." January 24th. The baby cried all last night. Calhoun has been a good baby, as babies go, and Bess says she has never heard him cry like that. He would not be comforted. He would not nurse. He cried facing the wall that faces the second room, and his eyes were open, and he was looking at the wall. At about 4 a.m, the crying stopped. I went to check on him, and he was asleep. And in the second room I heard the sound I cannot describe, except as something filling up. January 27th. I have moved the baby to the front room. Bess did not ask why. Mother knows. Now, I want to tell you about Willa. Because Willa Sowell, the youngest child, the one who was 3 years old when the family came to the Hollow in 1851, is 40 years old in the winter of 1877, and she is not in the hollow. And the reason she is not in the hollow is the reason this whole case does not end in the first winter. Willa Sowell had left in 1868, the same year as Reuben. She had married a man named Eck Combs, who was from her mother's family on the other side, and they had gone to Clay County and built a life there, and she had not come back to the hollow in 9 years. But she wrote to Patience, and Patience wrote back. And the letters went through the Clover Fork post office, and among the Patience papers that survived, there are 12 of Willa's letters, and the last 3 of them are from January and February of 1878. And they are the reason I know what I am about to tell you. Willa's first January letter is ordinary. News of Clay County, news of her children, asking after the baby, asking after Patience's health. But at the end of the letter, in a postscript that seems added after the rest was written, she says, "Mother, I had a dream about the hollow last night, and in the dream the spring was running backward, up into the wall instead of out of it, and I woke up with the smell of copper in my mouth. I do not know what to make of that. I am not a dreaming woman usually. Please tell me you are all right." Patience's reply does not survive. But Willa's second letter, dated about 3 weeks later, tells us what Patience must have said. She says, "Mother, your letter was not like your letters. I have read it 5 times, and I cannot find you in it. You told me everything is fine, but the words you used are not your words, and the order you put things in is not your order. And when you told me the winter was hard, but the garden would be good this year, I thought, nobody talks about the garden in January, and certainly you do not. I am asking you plainly to tell me, is there something in that house that you did not invite?" That last sentence. Is there something in that house that you did not invite? Willa Sowell, who had been 3 years old when she came to the hollow and had left at 30-40 years later in Clay County, dreamed about the spring running backward and woke with copper on her tongue and wrote to ask her elderly mother in those exact words whether something had gotten in. The knowing went down the women, the way Patience's letter said it did. Willa knew what to ask because she had been given what to ask. The same transmission that Patience had been given from her grandmother Harney Combs, from her great-grandmother Pole Combs, from however far back the line went into the mountains before the white families came, that same transmission had gotten to Willa. Not everything, not the full instruction, but enough to ask the right question. Patience's reply to that letter also does not survive. But Willa's third letter, dated the 14th of February, 1878, is in the collection, and it is the most important document in this case after the letter in the church ledger. She says, "I received your letter yesterday, and I read it 3 times, and I am coming. I know you said do not come. I know you said it is fine and there is nothing to worry about. Mother, you told me that Calhoun is sleeping well now. You told me Calhoun had the croup and was better. He did not have the croup when you wrote last month? You would not say that. You do not skip from not sick to had the croup, and is better without saying the croup in between. Something is answering your letters that is not you. I am coming on the Thursday coach." She says, "I am bringing Eck, and I am bringing salt." She says, "Do not tell it, I am coming. Do not tell it, I am coming." She knew it could read. She knew it could read the letters, or listen to the letters being read, or somehow know the content of the letters, because the letters were coming from the house that had it in it, and anything that passed through that house was available to it. She was writing to her mother, and she was writing past her mother to whatever might be reading over her mother's shoulder, and she was savvy enough to know the difference and to write accordingly. "Do not tell it I am coming." She arrived on a Saturday in late February, 1878. She came with her husband Eck, who was a big, quiet man, and she came with salt, and she came with 2 other things that she does not name in any surviving document, only calling them what she brought and what her mother told her to bring, which suggests they may have been things too particular to write down, or things she did not want the letter to carry. What happened when she arrived is the part of this case that exists only in one source. It is in the statement Reuben gave the minister in 1883, and Reuben was not there, and he got it from Willa. So it is Reuben's account of what Willa told him, which is 2 steps from the event. I want to be honest about that. But Reuben was a plain man, and Willa was a plain woman, and the account is plain, and the plain accounts are the ones I have learned to trust in cases like this. Willa and Eck came up the hollow road in the afternoon. They came on foot from where the wagon road ended, the last 1.5 miles. Willa said the hollow felt like being inside something. She said the light was wrong for February, too flat, too even. Not the thin slant light you get in a hollow in winter, but a light with no angle to it, like the light inside a cloud. She said the creek sounded wrong. Not the rushing of a winter creek in full run, but something slower, more deliberate, as though the water were thinking about which way to go. She said she held Eck's hand the whole last mile, and she is not, in Reuben's words, a hand-holding woman, which he means as a high compliment. They reached the house. Bess came to the door, and Willa said Bess looked like she was made of the wrong material, thin in the wrong way, like she had been used hard by something she could not name and could not leave. The baby was in Bess's arms, Calhoun, 3 months old, and Willa said the baby was quiet in a way that bothered her more than crying would have, a too still, too watching quiet that she did not know how to hold. And then Creel came to the door of the second room. Reuben gives it in Willa's words. He was big. That is the first thing. Very big and very still, standing in the doorway of the second room with one hand on the frame, and he looked at Willa, and Willa looked at him, and Willa said she had 2 thoughts at the same time, and the 2 thoughts were that he looks like nobody, and that he looks like everyone she ever knew. She said both things were true. She said it was like looking at a face made of all faces, where all the features were average and correct and assembled into a man, but the assembly had been done without love, without humor, without grief, without any of the things that make a face into a person. Correct. Simply correct. The way a map is correct. The way a mirror is correct. He said her name. He said, Willa, welcome. And she said she understood immediately, from the way he said it, that he had read the letter in which she had written, "Do not tell it I am coming," and that it had told her, by knowing her name, without being told it, that it had read the letter. She said welcome. That is the word. It said welcome in her sister-in-law's house, in the second room that her dead father had built against the wall that her mother had kept thick for a reason he never knew. Willa said, "Thank you kindly," and she went inside, and she sat with her mother in the front room, and she held Patience's hand, and she was very careful for the next 2 hours, not to look directly at Creel, not to eat anything in his presence, not to address him by name, and not to let him touch her, or the baby, or Eck. And at supper, when Bess began to set a place for him at the table, Willa said she had a headache and asked if they might eat in the front room tonight, just the family, just for the quiet. And Bess said yes, and Creel said nothing, and did not come to the table. After supper, when Luther and Eck were out at the barn, Willa told Bess, she told her the whole of it, the way her mother had told her, the hungry place, the feeding, the agreement, the offering, and what follows the second one. Bess listened, and did not say she was foolish, and did not go get Luther, and did not speak for a long time after Willa finished. And then Bess said one thing. She said, "I have known something was wrong. I have known it since the night I put my hand in the spring." She said, "What do we do?" And here is the place in the case where I have to be honest with you, because the honest answer to Bess's question is that Willa did not fully know. She had been given part of the instruction. She had been given enough to recognize the danger and enough to know certain things that would not help, and certain things that might. But the full instruction, the one that Patience had carried for 30 years, had been kept close, kept inside Patience, because Patience had not expected to be outlived by the thing she was managing. She had expected to keep feeding it until she died, and then she had expected to pass the feeding to Bess or to Willa, and she had not been given enough time to do that properly, and the thing had moved faster than she had thought it would when Luther opened the east wall. So what Willa knew was partial, and partial knowing in a hungry place is sometimes worse than no knowing at all, because it is enough to make you act and not enough to make you act right. What Willa knew was this: the agreement required regular feeding. If you fed it and then stopped feeding it, it grew hungry and it came closer. The feeding needed to happen outside and away from the table. It needed to happen at night, after dark, at the threshold, not inside the door. And after the second offering, the only way to revoke it was to take away what it had been given, which Patience had described to her as the hardest thing, harder even than the feeding, because you were taking back a gift that had already been received, and a hungry thing that has had its gift taken back is a different kind of problem than a hungry thing that has simply never been given. What Willa did not know was how to take back the gift. She had been told it was possible. She had not been told how. So she did what the women of her line had always done when they did not know the full instruction, which is this. She went to the oldest person who might know. There was a woman in Harlan County, not on Clover Fork, but further up toward the headwaters of Martin's Fork, a woman who was known, in the way that certain women are known in mountain communities, without anybody quite being willing to say exactly why they are known. Her name was Amma Sizemore. She was very old. Nobody would say how old, because nobody was sure, and the fact that nobody was sure is itself a piece of information, because in a county like Harlan County in 1878, people knew how old everybody was, because births and deaths were parish business, and everybody was in the same few parishes. But nobody knew how old Amma Sizemore was, because nobody could remember when she had been born, and nobody's parents could remember when she had been born, and there were men in their 60s who said their grandfathers had known her, and she had been old then, and she was the same now. Willa rode to see her on the Monday after she arrived, leaving Eck at the house. She went alone. On Luther's horse, 8 miles on bad roads in February, cold, and she found the place where Amma Sizemore lived, which was a cabin that Willa described as small and low and very old, cut into the south-facing slope of a ridge above the Martin's Fork Road, with a kitchen garden that was somehow green in February, and a spring that ran out of the rock above the cabin, the way the spring ran out of the rock above the Sowell house, and which, unlike the Sowell spring, made a sound as it ran that Willa described as entirely normal. And she said she only noticed the normalness because she had forgotten, in the months she had been in the hollow, what a normal spring was supposed to sound like. Amma Sizemore was sitting on her front step in February in no coat, and she did not stand up when Willa rode in. She watched Willa get off the horse, and she said, "Trace Creek," not a question. She said it the way you say the name of a thing you have been expecting. Willa said, "You know about Trace Creek." And Amma Sizemore said, "I know about all of them. Sit down." Willa sat on the step beside her, and Amma Sizemore looked at her for a while, looking at her the way she described as being looked at all the way through, not unkindly but thoroughly, the way a doctor looks at a sick person, with professional interest and professional distance, and no personal warmth at all. Then Amma Sizemore said, "Your grandmother kept it fed. Your grandmother made the first agreement. She was a Combs woman." And Willa said yes. And Amma Sizemore said, "And now your brother's wife has made the second offering, and your brother has put a room against the east wall, and the thing has moved from the spring to the room, and it came to the door as a man, and it has eaten at the table. And Willa said, Yes. And Amma Sizemore said, Tell me one thing. Did you look at it directly? And Willa said she had not. And the old woman said, Good. How many times did it eat at the table? And Willa said she did not know exactly. Many times. From December, and Amma Sizemore was quiet for a while, and she looked at the green garden, and then she said, 3 things I will tell you, and then I will not speak of this again, because I have said these things before, and they have not been enough, and I am tired. Willa, in Reuben's account, said, I am listening. The first thing Amma Sizemore said was that the feeding must continue. If you stop the feeding now, before the next agreement is made, what is in that house will stay in that house, and it will continue to eat, and what it will eat next will not be food. She said, You cannot starve it out of the house once it is in. You can only make the new agreement. And the new agreement is this. You move the feeding back outside, to the original threshold, and you keep the feeding there every night for 1 full year, 1 full turning of the seasons, and you do not invite it to the table, and you do not speak to it by the name it has given itself, and you do not look at it directly. If you do those 3 things for 1 full year, the agreement returns to what it was, and it goes back to the spring, and the spring will have it again, and you will have the spring back, and the hollow will hold. She said, If you miss even 1 night of the feeding, the year starts over. It does not forgive gaps. A gap is an invitation, and it will take the invitation. The second thing she said was that the man who built the room against the wall will not leave of his own choosing. He has been in that hollow all his life, and the hollow has gotten into him the way winter gets into a stone, and you cannot take it out of him without breaking the stone. You may tell him the truth. It will not help. The knowing does not help the men in this family. It has never helped the men. I am sorry for that, and I am telling you true. And the third thing was the hardest. Reuben says Willa told it with her hands in her lap and her voice flat, like someone setting a thing down after 5 years of carrying it. The third thing Amma Sizemore said was about the baby. She said, A thing that has eaten at the table will try to fix itself in the house. The way it fixes itself in a house is through the youngest life, because the youngest life does not yet know the difference between what is the house and what is in the house. The baby does not know that Creel is not family. The baby does not know that the second room is different from the front room. The baby will learn the hollow the same way it learns the family, whole, all at once, without distinction. And if the baby learns it that way, the agreement moves into the next generation in a different form. And the year's feeding will not be enough. And the agreement will need to be stronger, Willa said. What does stronger mean? And Amma Sizemore said, It means you move the baby out of that hollow before it learns to walk, and you do not bring it back until it knows the difference. She said, A child that walks in that hollow before it knows the difference will carry the hollow with it. It will carry it at a distance that is close enough for the hollow to feed on, no matter where the child lives. The hollow will not need to be in the same county. It will not need to be in the same state. 20 miles is not far enough, and 500 miles is not far enough. The child becomes the hollow's feeding, wherever the child goes. And Willa said, My mother wrote that. 20 miles is not far enough. I have been wrong about that all my life. She wrote that in 1884, 6 years from now. She wrote that in the margin of the Bible. And I said it to myself at the beginning of this account, and I told you I did not know what patience meant. Now you know. Now you know what Patience had been wrong about. She had thought that a child raised in the hollow who then left would be beyond its reach. She had been wrong, and something had happened by 1884 to teach her she was wrong. And the something that happened is the main body of this story and the main reason I am telling it. But I am getting ahead of myself again. We are still in February of 1878. Still at Amma Sizemore's step in the February cold, still at the third warning, Willa thanked her. The old woman said there was nothing to thank. Willa asked her how she knew all of this, and Amma Sizemore looked at her with that looking-through look, and she said, "I know about all of them, because I made most of the first agreements, in the beginning, when it was possible to make first agreements, and I am still alive," which tells you something about the cost, and what it tells you is not something you want to know. That is all she said. Willa rode back to Trace Creek Hollow in the February cold, and she did the three things. She moved the feeding back to the threshold, outside the door, after dark, covered with a cloth, every night. She told Luther the truth, or as much of it as Amma Sizemore had said the truth could be told to the men of that family. Luther listened and did not leave, and did not stop building the east room, and did not order Creel out of the house, and did not look any different the next morning than he had the morning before, because he had decided what he had decided, and the deciding was not a decision he could undecide. And she moved the baby. She told Bess what Amma had said about Calhoun, and Bess listened. And this is the part of Willa's account, as Reuben tells it, that I find most striking and most true. Bess did not argue. Bess did not say, "Surely not," or, "But he is so young," or, "But I cannot leave." Bess listened to the third warning, and she said, "When?" And Willa said, "As soon as I can arrange it." She arranged it in 2 weeks. She wrote to Dorcas, Luther's sister in Bell County, and Dorcas agreed to take the baby, and at the end of February 1878, Bess Sowell put her 3-month-old son Calhoun into a wagon with her sister-in-law Willa and her brother-in-law Eck, and she watched the wagon go up the hollow road and out of sight, and she went back into her house with Creel in the second room and Luther, who would not leave, and she began the year. She was 28 years old. The year. I want you to understand what a year of that was like, because it is easy to say the words, "Keep feeding. Do not speak his name. Do not look directly." 1 full year. It sounds like a rule. It does not sound like a life. Luther's farm log from March 1878 through February 1879 is the most detailed part of the log. He wrote almost every day, where before he had sometimes skipped a week. I think he wrote because he needed to be accountable to something, needed to be a man who put words to the days in order to feel that the days were real, and in order and one thing after another, and not what they were beginning to feel like, which was one long thing, undivided, with the darkness on both sides. The log entries from that year are, on the surface, the entries of a farm. Wood cut, animals tended, fences mended, weather noted. But woven through the ordinary entries, sometimes in the same sentence, sometimes in a note at the bottom of the page as though added afterward, there is another record, and that record is the record of living with Creel, March 4th, 1878. Creel helped with the plowing. He is stronger than 2 men and does not tire. He goes to the spring twice a day, and I do not follow him. The feeding is going well. Bess does not miss a night. March 19th. Creel asked me today if the baby was coming back. I said, "Not until summer." He said, "Is that sure? Is that certain?" I said, "Yes." He said, "All right." And he went back to the second room, and he was quiet all that afternoon and evening, which was a different quiet than his usual quiet, heavier, darker at the edges. Bess heard it too. We did not talk about it at the table. April 2nd. Have been thinking about the baby question. I did not tell Creel the baby was gone because Creel was a problem. I told him the baby was at my sister's because Dorcas had asked to see him, which is true. I have been trying to decide if it matters that I told him the truth, whether it matters that the truth was available to him. I believe it does not matter. I believe it hears what it wants to hear and whatever is said to it, and the rest is weather to it. April 15th. Something about the garden. The spring water this year is making things come up very fast. The greens came up in 10 days from seed. The corn is up 6 inches in a week and a half. I have not touched the water from the spring since January. Bess uses the creek water for the kitchen. But I use the spring water on the garden because that is the agreement, and it seemed safest to keep to the agreement even in that. The garden is going to be extraordinary this year, and I do not want to eat a single thing that comes out of it. He wrote that, and then underlined it. In the farm log of a man who is trying to stay sane. The garden is going to be extraordinary this year, and I do not want to eat a single thing that comes out of it. May 3rd. A man came up the hollow from the Clover Fork Road today, a peddler, selling needles and cloth out of a pack. He had a mule and a pack, and he was the first person we have had come up here in 4 months. He ate at the table. Bess fed him. And the whole time he was at the table, Creel stood in the doorway of the second room and looked at him. And the peddler kept glancing over at Creel, in the way you glance at something that you keep seeing out of the corner of your eye, but does not look right when you look full at it. He left quickly. He left so quickly he forgot his hat, and I had to run it down to him, and when I came back, Creel was gone, and then he was just in the second room again when I looked, as though he had been there all along. May 29th. Bess has not been well. She is tired in a way that is not sickness. Not any sicknesses I know. She does the feeding every night. She does the work. But she is thinning out, the way the animals thin in this hollow, not sick, just less. I have been trying to feed her more, and she eats more, and she stays the same. Like the eating does not arrive anywhere. Like the eating does not arrive anywhere. He used the same words he had used about Creel. The parallel is not an accident. He had begun to see it. June 21st, midsummer. Halfway through the year, Bess has kept every night without a gap. I counted back. Not one night missed. The thing in the second room has been less present this month, harder to account for in the house, as if by some measure the agreement is beginning to take effect. Or perhaps I have gotten used to it, which is a different thing and a worse thing in its way. And here is the entry I have read more times than any other entry in the Soul papers, because it is July 2nd, 1878, and because what Luther saw, or thought he saw, on the evening of July 2nd is the clearest account in any document of what the thing was actually doing, and why it had come to the door in the first place. He writes, "This evening at dusk I was at the woodpile, the north side of the house, the side away from the spring, and I had my back to the house and I was splitting wood. I heard Creel come out of the second room door, which opens onto the back, and I did not turn. I have learned not to turn. And I heard him go toward the spring, as he does, and I heard him stop at the spring, and I kept splitting wood. And then I heard him do the thing I have never heard him do, which is speak. He said something to the spring in a voice I could not understand, too low and too fast, and I stopped and I listened, and he said it again. And then I heard the spring answer. The spring said something back, and it was not the sound of water. It was a voice. It was a small voice, thin, the way voices are in the cold. And it said what sounded like a question. And Creel answered. And the spring answered again. And I stood there with the axe in my hand, and I did not turn around. And after a while, the conversation stopped, and Creel went back into the second room, and I split the rest of the wood, and I went inside. And I did not say anything to Bess, because I did not have words for it that were the right size. But I have been thinking since, and I think what I understood, not from the words but from the shape of the exchange, the way you understand a conversation in a room next door through a wall, just the shape of it, is that Creel was reporting, like a man making a report to his boss, saying what has been accomplished and what has not, and what the count is and what the timeline is, and the spring was asking about the baby, about where the baby had gone, and when it was coming back. And Creel was saying, not yet. Not yet. A patient thing. Reporting to a patient thing. About a baby that had been moved 8 miles away, and both of them confident that the baby would come back, because the baby would always come back, because the hollow is its home, and babies come home. I do not know what to do with that knowledge. I am splitting wood. I am going to give you the second half of that year in less detail, because the detail is in the log, and the log runs long, and I want to save room for what comes after, which is where the damage spreads. What matters from August through January of that year is this. The feeding held. Bess did not miss a night. The thing in the second room was present and was not present in alternation, sometimes visible and audible and apparently solid, sometimes gone from the house for days, and they learned not to speculate about where it went when it was gone. The baby stayed at Dorcas's in Bell County. Luther's farm log becomes, through the fall, less about Creel and more about the farm itself, as though the writing were finding its old shape again, and that is the clearest sign that the agreement was returning to something that could be managed. Patience Sowell died on the 22nd of January, 1879. She died in her corner bed in the front room, in the night, quietly, the way she had done everything. Luther found her in the morning. She had died in her sleep, at 73 years old, and the last entry in the marginal notations of the family Bible is in her hand, dated 3 days before she died. And it is not a warning, and it is not an instruction. It is a prayer. It is 4 lines of Scripture and then 1 line in her own words, and the line in her own words is, "I have kept the feeding as long as I can. The keeping now belongs to the next one. Lord, let the next one be steady enough." She was talking about Bess. And Bess was steady enough, which is not nothing. Bess kept the feeding through that winter, and through the spring, and through the summer of 1879. And the thing called Creel became, over those months, less solid, less present, less in the house. By the fall of 1879, Luther's log mentions him infrequently, and the mentions are brief and almost offhand, the way you mention a familiar piece of weather. Creel quiet today, Creel at the spring, Creel not in the house. And in the February of 1880, Luther writes, plainly and without emphasis, as though it were the most ordinary entry in the log. He writes, "Creel is gone. He was not here this morning, and his things are gone from the second room, what little he had. The room is cold, but it is an ordinary cold. Bess checked the spring this morning, and she said, 'The water is right.' I told her she could stop the feeding now, and she said she would think about it. I said she had been steady. She said she knew. We had breakfast. The year had held. The agreement had returned to what it had been, or close enough to what it had been that the house was a house again, and the spring was a spring again, and the thing in the second room was in the second room no longer. The baby came home in March of 1880, 2 years old, walking and talking and entirely himself. Luther and Bess drove to Bell County to get him, a trip of 2 days each way, and brought him back in the wagon in the last of the winter cold, and Bess held him the whole way, and Luther drove, and they came up the hollow road in the early spring afternoon. And the hollow was the hollow, ordinary and shadowed, and there is a notation in the family Bible, in Bess's hand, from that spring. It is the first notation in the family Bible after Patience's last entry in January of 1879. Bess writes only that Calhoun is home, that the spring runs right, and that she will keep the feeding. She kept it. For 30 years, Bess Sowell kept the feeding. She kept it the way Patience had kept it, in the dark, after her husband was asleep, a plate covered with a cloth set outside the door, retrieved in the morning. She did it every night that winter, and every winter after, and in the summers too, because Patience had fed it every winter, and she decided she was not going to assume it was only a winter thing. She fed it every night for 30 years, until she died in 1909 of pneumonia at 59 years old. And for 20 years, from 1880 to 1900, it held. The hollow was a hollow. The farm was a farm. Luther died in 1892 of something the doctor called a tired heart, and what I suspect was the long cost of 20 years of knowing and not saying and splitting wood. Calhoun grew up in the hollow, and he knew about the feeding because Bess told him when he was old enough to be told, and he helped her with it when he was old enough to help. And when he was 30, in 1901, he married a woman named Cora Fry, who was no relation to Bess but was from the same Fry kin on Clover Fork. And Cora came to the hollow, and Bess told her what she was marrying into, and Cora said, almost word for word, what Bess had said to Willa in 1878. She said, "What do we do?" And Bess said, "Feed it every night, never at the table, outside the door after dark, and never miss a night, because a gap is an invitation, and it will take the invitation." And Cora said, "All right." Cora is the writer. Cora is the one who left the most complete record. And the record is the 17 letters she wrote between 1902 and 1919 to her cousin Hallie Fry in Middlesboro, Kentucky, and which Hallie's granddaughter found in a trunk in 1973, and which eventually made their way into the possession of the Harlan County Historical Society, where they are kept in a gray archival box in a room that does not have its temperature controlled as well as it should, and where I read them over 2 days in a November that felt appropriate to the reading. Cora Sowell was a schoolteacher before she married Calhoun. She was sharp and plain-spoken and methodical, with a habit of explaining things twice, once plainly and once in what she called more particular terms. She wrote it to her cousin Hallie because Hallie was the one person she trusted who was not in the hollow, and because Cora believed a thing witnessed in writing is harder to lose than a thing that only lives in two women's understanding. Her first letter about it is dated March of 1902. She has been in the hollow for a year, and she is writing to tell Hallie about the feeding, about what Bess told her about the spring, and the second room, and the man called Creel, who came in the winter of 1877 and stayed a year and then went, and she is writing it carefully, in the plain way of a former schoolteacher who wants to be precise. But at the end of the letter she says something that is not in any other document, and that I think is the most significant observation in this entire case. She says, "I have been feeding it for a year now, every night, no exceptions. And here is the thing I have noticed that Mother did not tell me to notice, and that I think she did not notice herself, and that I think is important." She says, "The plate is never empty." She says, "I put the food out, and I cover it, and I take the plate in the morning, and the food is gone. Not eaten in the way food is eaten, not touched or moved about. Gone, as though it has been absorbed, as though the plate were a surface that received it. The cloth is folded, not crumpled, not tossed aside, folded neatly and set beside the plate. Every morning, the same fold." She says, "I do not think it is eating the food. I think the food is the token. I think the agreement is the thing, not the food. The food is what you put on the agreement to make the agreement real, the way you put your name on a contract. The name is not the thing. The thing is the promise behind the name," she says. "And I think, because of this, that the feeding is not infinite. I think there is a point at which the token becomes so familiar that it is not a token anymore, but a habit, and I think habits can be broken more easily than agreements. And I am frightened, a little, that we have been doing this so long that what we are doing is no longer an agreement, but a habit, and I do not know what to do about that fear. The plate is never empty. The cloth is always folded." That observation in 1902 is the seed of what happens in 1914. But between 1902 and 1914, There is the matter of what happened to Calhoun, and what happened to Calhoun is the thing Patience had been wrong about. The thing she wrote in 1884, 20 miles, is not far enough. Because Calhoun had spent 2 years in Bell County as a baby, and he had come back to the hollow when he was 2 years old, walking and talking, and apparently himself, and he had grown up normal in every way that a person in that hollow could grow up normal, and he had taken over the farm when Luther died, and had married Cora, and was by all accounts a solid, decent, unhurried man. But he had spent his first 2 years in that hollow. Before Bell County, before he was moved, he had spent 2 years in the hollow as an infant, in the house with the thing called Creel, and Amma Sizemore had said the danger was in a baby learning the hollow before it knew the difference, and Calhoun had been there for 2 months before Bess moved him, and 2 months in the life of an infant is not nothing. The school teacher's diary is where this comes from. Ottiline Pratt, the teacher who was in the hollow from 1891 to 1897, was 22 years old when she arrived, and 38 when she left, which is to say, she arrived young and left, having given up any ambition she had started with of becoming ordinary. She taught the Sowell children through most of the 90s, including the second generation, Calhoun's younger siblings, and she knew Calhoun as an adult, and she wrote about him the way you write about someone you have watched carefully for a long time and have concluded something about. Her diary is not sensational. It is a teacher's diary, full of lessons and weather and the ordinary frustrations of a one-room school in a hollow where the children came when they could and were absent when they could not. But in the margins of that diary, and in the longer entries on Sundays when she had time, there is a different record, and the different record is about the hollow and about Calhoun. She writes, in the fall of 1891, her first fall, that there is something about the way Calhoun Sowell moves through this hollow that I cannot account for. He knows it the way a person knows a room in their own house in the dark, without hesitation, without looking, but it is more than familiarity. He moves through it as though it responds to him, as though the hollow arranges itself around his path, as though he does not walk through the hollow, but the hollow walks around him. She writes, 2 years later, in 1893, I have decided that Calhoun Sowell is a good man, and I have decided that being a good man in this hollow does not mean what being a good man means anywhere else. In another county, he would be unremarkable. Here he is, the hinge the whole place turns on. The hollow is tethered to him. That is the best I can do with it. The hollow is tethered to him. She did not know, when she wrote that Calhoun had been 2 months old when the thing called Creel came to the door. She did not know about the agreement or the feeding or the year. She only had what she could see, which was a man who moved through a dark hollow as though the hollow knew him, and who was not frightened of it, and who was not frightened of it in a way that was different from ordinary courage. He was not frightened of it because it was part of him. He had been 2 months old, and it had fed next to him at the table, and it had spoken to the spring about him when he was gone, and it had waited for him to come back, and he had come back, and he had grown up in the hollow with the feeding at the door every night, and he had grown into the hollow the way a tree grows into a wall, neither of them quite what they would have been alone. And here, at the midpoint of this account, I want to stop and give you the full weight of what has been built over these 30 years, because the next part of the story is the part where it spreads, and if you do not feel the full weight of the first 30 years, the spreading will not have its proper gravity. What Patience Sowell built in those 30 years from 1851 to 1877 was a management, a system, a careful, daily, unglamorous agreement maintained in the dark, alone, after everyone she loved was asleep, for her whole adult life in that hollow. She built it on partial knowledge, on what her mother had given her and what her grandmother had given her mother, on a tradition of women passing down the shape of a danger without ever passing down the full instruction for what to do when it got past you. And Luther broke the east wall open, not out of malice, out of need and cold, and the reasonable desire for more room. And Bess fed a stranger at the table, not out of foolishness, out of hospitality, out of the instinct that a cold person at the door is a person who needs to eat. And both of those things were ordinary, and both of them were catastrophic. And the catastrophe was not a moment, but a slow accumulation of days and meals and small decencies done in a place that counted them all. What Bess rebuilt in that year from February 1878 to February 1880 was a different thing from what Patience had built. It was the same structure, the same feeding, the same outside the door and never at the table, and 1 full year without a gap. But it was rebuilt on top of a damage that the rebuilding did not fully repair, because Calhoun had been in the house for those 2 months, and the hollow had tasted him before he left, and the hollow was patient, and Calhoun came back. What Cora inherited in 1901 was a 43-year marriage between the hollow and the Sowell family, managed with a plate and a cloth, and the dark and the patience of the women who kept it. What she observed in the first year was that the plate was never empty and the cloth was always folded in the same fold. And what she feared, by 1902, was that the habit was eroding the agreement. She was right. She was right in the way that the women of that line were always right, which is to say, a little too late to be useful. If you are still with me at this point in the dark, I want to say one thing before we go any further. The collection is called What the Table Remembers, and it is 12 of these cases, all of them documented, all of them from county records and family papers, and the kind of evidence you can hold in your hands. Every one of those 12 cases is a house that made an agreement it did not mean to make. This is one of them. 9 hours of them in total. And if this one has gotten under your skin the way it has gotten under mine, the next 11 will not leave you either. The link is down below. And come back from wherever you went to get that glass of water, because this is where the account gets worse, and I promise you the worse is worth staying for. Now then, 1914. Calhoun Sowell had 3 children with Cora. The first was a boy named Press, born in 1903. The second was a girl named Leora, born in 1906. The third was a boy named Denton, born in 1911. 3 children, and Cora managed the feeding through all 3 of their infancies without missing a night, and all 3 were kept away from the spring and away from the east wall, and none of them were allowed to drink the spring water, and by the time Press was 10 years old, he knew about the feeding the way children, who are raised inside a particular practice, know about it, matter-of-factly, in the way that other children know about setting the table before supper, or saying grace. But here is the thing that Cora did not account for, and could not have accounted for because it was not in any of the instruction she had received, not from Bess, and not from Willa, and not from anyone who had been in that hollow before her. She did not account for what it meant for a child to grow up in a house where the feeding was a nightly practice. Because Press and Leora and Denton grew up knowing about the feeding the way children grow up knowing about anything their family does consistently in the night when the parents think the children are asleep. They knew about it in the partial, sideways way of children, which is to say they knew about it without quite knowing what it was, and the knowing without the what it was is the most dangerous kind of knowing there is, because it combines the familiarity with none of the respect. Press Sowell, at 11 years old, started feeding it himself. Not the plate and the cloth and the door, the way Cora did it. He went to the spring in the evenings, after school, and he brought it things. Not food at first. He brought it rocks from the creek bed, interesting shapes he had found, and he laid them at the edge of the spring basin, and he talked to the spring the way an 11-year-old talks to a place that seems to listen, which is to say naturally, without fear, without ceremony, in the language of a child to a friend. Cora found out in the spring of 1914. She found out because Press, who had been a healthy, ordinary child, was thinning out. the way the soul children always thinned in that hollow when the agreement was going wrong. Not sick, just less. The way the animals were less. She asked him. He told her, simply, that he fed it too, that he had been feeding it since he was 9, that he talked to it and it talked back through the sound of the water, and that it had a name, not Creel, a different name. A name that it had given him, and that he would not tell her the name because it had asked him not to. Cora's letter to Hallie about this is the longest letter she ever wrote. It is 12 pages, front and back, in her careful school-teacher hand, and it covers 3 full days of trying to understand what her son had done and what it meant, and whether it could be undone, and the answer to the last question, which she arrived at on the 3rd day, and which she wrote down in the letter with the clarity of a woman who has stopped hoping for a different answer, is no. She writes, "He has made his own agreement. He has made it without knowing what an agreement is, without knowing what a table is and what outside the table means, without knowing that there is a difference between the 2 sides of the door. He has made it the way a child makes any agreement, which is by being innocent of the cost." She writes, "And the difference between Press's agreement and mine, between his agreement and Bess's and Patience's before her, is this. His agreement was made in the daylight, at the spring, in conversation, in friendship. He gave it his name." She writes, "I cannot undo what I cannot know how to undo. I do not know how to undo the daylight feeding. I do not know how to undo the friendship. I do not know how to undo the name." She writes, "I am going to send him to his Aunt Leora in Clay County, the way Bess sent Calhoun to Dorcas, the way it has always been done. And I am going to pray that Clay County is far enough." And then she writes the last line of that letter, and the last line is not about Press. She writes, "And in the night, after I had decided about Clay County, I heard my daughter humming. She was in the loft, asleep, and she was humming with her mouth closed, low, tuneless, steady, the kind of hum that goes on without the person knowing it is going on, the way a child hums when her mind is somewhere else. And the tune, if you could call it a tune, was the same rhythm as the water sounds in the spring basin, which I have listened to for 13 years, and which I know the way, I know the sound of my own name." Leora was 8 years old. I told you at the beginning that Leora's soul was the last of that line to live in the hollow, and that she left in 1921 on a February morning with a flour sack, and never told her children why, only that the house had been given away. She was 8 years old in 1914, and she was humming in her sleep, and she was humming the spring. That is where the case turns outward, and that is where the damage leaves the hollow for the first time, in the bodies and the habits and the agreements of the children who were raised inside it. Calhoun's children, Patience's great-grandchildren, the generation that did not know the full instruction because the full instruction had never been given cleanly, had only ever been passed down in fragments, mother to daughter, each fragment a little smaller than the one before. Press went to Clay County. He did not get better. I want to be specific here, because the specificity is what makes this particular horror real rather than general. Press Soul arrived in Clay County in the summer of 1914 at his great-aunt's house, which was the same house that Calhoun had gone to in 1878, which was the house of Dorcas Soul Goins's granddaughter by then, because Dorcas herself had been dead since 1904. He was 11 years old, and he was thin, and he had the look that people in that hollow got when the agreement was going wrong, the not sick look, the less look, the look of something being used that does not know it is being used. He got thinner. He did not eat well. Not that he refused food. He ate. But the eating did not arrive anywhere, to use Luther's phrase. And Luther had used it about Creel, and now here was Creel's phrase describing Luther's great-grandson. He started going to the creek at night, the creek behind his great-aunt's house, which was an ordinary creek in an ordinary county, with no hungry spring above it, and no sandstone basin cut by somebody older than the county, he went in the night and sat by it. And his great-aunt found him there 3 times, and the first 2 times she brought him in, and the 3rd time she went and got the minister. And the minister came and sat with the boy at the creek in the dark, and afterward told the great-aunt that the boy had said the creek was not right. It did not sound right. It did not talk the right way. And the minister told the great-aunt that the boy was not well, and perhaps should see a doctor. The doctor said he was thin and should eat more. The doctor was not wrong. In the fall of 1914, Press Sowell walked from his great-aunt's house in Clay County back to Trace Creek Hollow, 40 miles, in 3 days, in October cold, and arrived looking no worse than when he had left in July. He came up the hollow road, and he came to the house, and he went to the spring, and he stood at the basin for a long time. Cora found him there. She said, in the letter she wrote to Hallie about it, that she stood at the edge of the clearing that had the spring in it, and she looked at her son standing at the basin, and she understood in that moment, with a completeness that she had not wanted to arrive at, that he was not going to leave the hollow again. She said, "He is tethered to it, the same way his father is tethered to it, but closer. His father was 2 months old when it first fed next to him. Press has been feeding it himself since he was 9. The tether is shorter," she said. "I can see it from here. From where I am standing, I can see the difference in the distance between where he is and where the hollow ends. His father can walk out to the Clover Fork Road without difficulty and come home again. Press cannot walk to the mouth of the hollow without turning around. And last summer he walked 40 miles to get back to the spring." She said, "I think that when he told it his name, and it gave him its name in return, it put a line in him, not a chain, not a rope. A line, the way you put a mark on a tree to tell which trees are yours in a forest. He is marked, and the mark is what pulls. I put a line in him." I have sat with that phrase for a long time, and I think Cora Sowell, the former school teacher, found the right phrase for something that nobody had ever found the right phrase for before. It put a line in him, the way the thing put a line in the Sowell Hollow itself, back in a time before patience and before pole combs and before the first white settlement, a line that said, "This ground is mine, this spring is mine, this hunger is mine, and the hunger is patient, and it keeps the line, and the line keeps." Press stayed. He lived in the hollow with his parents and his sister and his younger brother, and he was not unhappy. He was not disordered. He was not what a doctor would have called sick. He was thin, and he went to the spring at night, and he did not talk much about what he heard there, and by his mid-teens he was doing the work of the farm alongside his father, and by his 20s he was capable of leaving for a day or 2 at a time before the pull became too strong, and by his 30s he had stopped trying. Leora was different. Leora Sowell was 8 in 1914 when Cora heard her humming the spring in her sleep. She was, by Cora's account, and by the schoolteacher Ottoline Pratt's account from the decade before, the sharpest of the 3 children, the one who asked the most direct questions and expected the most complete answers, and was most reliably unsatisfied with anything that was not one. She had asked Cora about the feeding when she was 6. She had asked what it was for and what it was feeding and what happened if they stopped. Cora had told her the truth, in the simplified form that a 6-year-old could hold, and Leora had listened, and then she had asked one question that Cora says she could not answer. She had asked what it wants, not what is it, not what does it do, what does it want, and Cora had said she did not know, and Leora had said someone should find out. She was 6. She was 15 in 1921, which is the year she left. She was the last Sowell to live in the hollow, and what happened in the 3 years between 1914 and 1917 that made her decide, at 15, to pack a flour sack and go is in the letters and in one other document that I have not yet mentioned, which is a statement she gave in 1944 to a woman who came to her house in Middlesboro, Kentucky, and asked to speak with her about Trace Creek Hollow. The woman was a folklorist from the State University, conducting an oral history project on folk belief and land use in the mountain counties. Her name does not appear in the surviving transcript, which runs to 11 pages and which was among the materials donated to the Harlan County Historical Society after the folklorist's death. But Leora's voice is in it, clearly, and her voice is not the voice of an old woman performing a story. It is the voice of a woman who has been waiting for someone to ask, and who has decided that the asking is enough, and who is going to answer fully, one time, and then not again. She begins by saying that she needs to tell you about the years between 1914 and 1917, because that is where I understand what the hollow was, and that is where I decided what I was going to do about it. She says, "In 1915, the year after Cora sent Press to Clay County, my father went to the spring and did not come back," she says. Not the first time. The first time was in the fall of 1915, in September, and he was gone for 2 days. We found him at the spring. He was sitting on the edge of the basin with both feet in the water, and he had been there long enough that the cold of the water had gone up into his legs, and he could not stand. He was not distressed. He was not frightened. He said he had sat down for a minute, and the time had gotten away from him, and Cora and Press got him up and brought him in, and he was all right in a day. She says, "It happened again in November, and again in February, and each time it was longer. And each time when we found him, he was less aware that time had passed, and each time the walk back from the spring to the house was shorter because he was sitting closer to the house than the spring is." She says, "By the spring of 1916, he was sleeping in the second room, not the front room or the loft, the second room, the room that Luther had built against the east wall, the room where Creel had lived for a year. He moved himself there in March of 1916, and Cora let him, because she did not know what else to do, and because she was afraid that not letting him would be worse." She says, "And that spring, the garden came up the way it had not come up since the first year. Better than it should have, better than the ground of that hollow should have permitted. Everything we planted came up fast and full and green, the way it had in the early years when patience was feeding it right, and the agreement was in good shape. And Cora said, 'Do not eat it.' She said every year, she said, 'Do not eat the garden.' And every year Press and Father ate the garden anyway, because there is a limit to what a person will refuse to eat when they are hungry. And Cora knew that limit, and she kept saying it, and they kept eating." She says, "And Denton. Denton was the youngest, born in 1911. He was 5 in 1916. He was small and dark-eyed and serious in the way of very young children who have been around adults who are being careful, who absorbs the care without understanding the reason. He was old enough to know about the feeding, the way Press and Leora had known about it at the same age, in the sideways way of children. Leora says, Denton did not go to the spring. I want to be clear about that. He was told not to go to the spring, and he did not go. He was a good boy. He did not go to the spring. But he started, in the summer of 1916, setting out his supper food before bed. Not for us. Not for the dogs. Just a little of whatever he had eaten, put on a piece of cloth, set on the floor beside his bed. Cora asked him about it, and he said he did not know why. He just wanted to. He said it felt right. He said, "Somebody ought to have some. Somebody ought to have some." He was 5 years old, and he had developed, entirely on his own, a version of the feeding. Not the plate at the door, the cloth beside the bed. A 5-year-old's version of the agreement, made not because he understood the agreement, but because the hollow had gotten close enough to him that the shape of the agreement had gotten into his instincts before the instruction could. Leora says, I was 9 years old watching this happen, and I did not have words for what I understood, but I understood something very specific. I understood that the hollow was not waiting anymore, that in the years since Press had made his own agreement, it had stopped waiting. It had begun reaching toward my father at the spring, reaching toward Denton through his instincts, reaching back toward Press whenever he tried to be in Clay County. And I understood, at 9 years old, that the hollow was working through us the way weather works through a wall, finding every gap, every thin place, and coming through. She says, I decided to leave when I was 9. I did not go until I was 15 because I could not go at 9. But I decided at 9, and here I want to ask you a question, and I want you to hold the question because the case is not done, and the question will get more specific as we go. What did the hollow want? Leora Sowell asked it at 6. She is asking it again at 9, this time not as a curious question, but as a survival question. She is asking it because she needs to know, before she can leave, whether the wanting is the kind that can be satisfied or the kind that cannot. And the answer to that question is the thing that nobody in her family has ever answered, because nobody in her family has ever had the full instruction, and the full instruction is the only thing that answers it. She goes back to Amma Sizemore. She goes in the fall of 1916, when she is 10 years old, by herself, on her father's horse, 8 miles on bad roads. She goes, and she comes back. And what Amma Sizemore told her is in the 1944 statement, in full. She says, Amma Sizemore was the same. That is the only way I can tell it. She was sitting on her step, in October, in no coat. And she looked the same as Willa had described her. And Willa had been there in 1878, and by 1916, that was 38 years. And Amma Sizemore had been old in 1878, and she was the same. I do not know what to do with that, and I am not going to pretend I do, she says. She knew who I was before I said my name. She said, Leora, Trace Creek, sit down, she says. I told her everything, all of it. My father at the spring, Press in Clay County, Denton's cloth beside the bed, my mother with no sleep and the plate every night and the clock fold on the cloth every morning, and Amma Sizemore listened, the same way Willa said she listened all the way through without speaking. And then she said, as she had said to Willa, 3 things I will tell you, and I will not speak of it again, because these things are mine to say, and I say them to one soul and one Trace Creek person in each generation, and the saying is, all I have to give. Leora says, and I said I was listening. The first thing Amma Sizemore said was that your grandmother's feeding held it for 30 years. Your great-aunt's year held it back once. Your mother has held it for 15 years. But feeding is management, and management is not resolution. And what has no resolution gets more, not less, over time. The hollow in Trace Creek is deeper now than it was when your great-grandmother Patience came to it, because 65 years of feeding has grown it the way rain grows a river. You cannot feed a hungry thing to satisfaction. You can only feed it to patience, and its patience is older than your family, and it will outlast your family if you stay. She says, the second thing Amma Sizemore told me was the one I had been asking since I was 6 years old. She says, she told me what it wants. She says, Amma Sizemore told me that what the hungry places want is not food, not company, not worship. What they want is continuance. They are the hunger of a ground that has been empty too long, and what they want is to not be empty. And they reach toward life the way roots reach toward water, not out of malice, not out of love, out of old necessity, because they are what they are, and what they are has been hungry since before there was a name for hungry. She says, she told me that the feeding works, for a time, because the feeding is a form of continuance. You feed it and it continues. But she said that the feeding over generations trains it to expect the family, and when the feeding trains it to expect the family becomes the feeding, and then the food on the plate is incidental, because what it is eating is the family's presence, the family's year, the family's children, and it is patient enough to take that slowly, one generation at a time, and you will not notice the taking because it looks exactly like ordinary life in a hollow, ordinary work, ordinary thin children, ordinary spring water in a clay jar on the garden. She said the feeding cannot be stopped without consequence. She said stopping it cold after this many generations would be like pulling a tree out of a wall. The wall would come with it. And here, in the 1944 statement, Leora pauses. The transcript says only the word pause. About 30 seconds of pause, timed by the folklorist. And then she says, and I said to her, then what do we do? I was 10 years old, and I asked her, then what do we do? And she said, the third thing. She said, you leave, and you do not come back, and you do not bring the hollow with you, she said. The trick of leaving a hungry place is not to let it know you are deciding. If it knows you are deciding to leave, it will work through whoever it already has, and what it already has in your family is your father and your brother, and it will use them to keep you there, not by force. A hungry place does not use force. It uses the fact that you love the people who are in it. It will use your love for your father and your brother, and if you let it, your love will be enough to keep you. And then Denton's children will be what Denton is now, and Denton is 5,000 years old and already setting out the cloth. She said, you make a decision in your heart without making it with your mouth, and you do not say goodbye, because goodbye is a gap, and a gap is an invitation. You walk out on an ordinary morning like you are going to the store, and you do not come back. She says, and then she said one more thing. She said, when you are out, you will know if you have brought it with you. She said, you will know by one sign. She said, the sign will be a smell, not a sound, not a sight, a smell. She said, if you smell copper, in a place where there is no copper, in the air of wherever you have gone, you will know it has come through you, and not through the hollow, and that is a different thing to manage, and a harder one, but it can be managed, and the managing of that she could tell me if I needed it. She says, I said I hoped I would not need it. She said, we always hope that, and then she said she would not speak of it again. And Leora rode home. She lived in the hollow for 5 more years. 5 years of knowing she was going to leave without saying so, of knowing the shape of what she was in, and not letting the hollow know that she knew. 5 years of ordinary mornings and ordinary work, and the plate at the door every night, and her father sleeping in the second room, and Press at the spring in the evenings, and Denton growing up, and the garden always extraordinary, and the spring water in the clay jar, and the clock fold on the cloth every morning. 5 years is a long time to be 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, a long time to be the one who knows and cannot say. And in those 5 years she learned the hollow. She learned it the way you learn a thing you are preparing to leave, thoroughly and without attachment, the way a person in a bad house learns every creak of the floor, not because they love the floor, but because they are going to have to cross it in the dark. She learned, for instance, the rhythm of Creel's absences, because Creel was not gone. She had been told he was gone. In 1980, her father told her Creel had gone, and the log and the letters told the same story. But she had been in the hollow 5 years, and she knew by then that gone was a different word in that hollow than it was anywhere else. Gone in Trace Creek Hollow meant not currently taking a shape you could see. It did not mean absent. She felt it in the second room sometimes, the same something being very still in a small space feeling that Reuben had described as a child, and she felt it more often near the spring, and she felt it in the lean of the trees, and she felt it in the fold of the cloth. She learned the pattern of the spring. She did not go to the spring, but she listened to it from the east window, the window Patience had kept, small and thick, and she learned the sound of the water at different times of day and different times of year and different weather, and she learned to hear the difference between the water talking to itself and the water talking to something else. She learned the smell of the hollow, which is the most important thing she learned, and the thing that, in the 1944 statement, she takes the most time to describe. She says, "The hollow has a smell. Not a bad smell. Not a good smell. A particular smell. The way certain rooms have a particular smell, and the smell is part of the room, and you do not notice it until you have been out of the room for a while and then come back in. The hollow smells of cold water and wet sandstone, and something underneath those, something older and drier and deeper, the way old rooms smell of the wood and the plaster, and something that has been in the room longer than the room has. That is the hollow's smell," she says. And the smell of copper is different from the hollow's smell. The copper smell is not in the hollow. It is not in the spring, and it is not in the second room, and it is not in the east wall. It is in the people. My father smells of copper sometimes when he has been at the spring long. Press smells of it when he comes back from trying to leave. And Denton, who is 11 years old in 1921, smells of it on certain mornings, after the nights when the cloth beside his bed is empty. She says, "I have checked myself every morning for 5 years. Every morning I stand outside before the sun is up, and I breathe in and I try to know if I smell of copper. So far, I do not think I do, but I know that I cannot be the judge of my own smell, and so I have been watching for other signs. And the other sign I have been watching for is what Amma Sizemore said it would do if it had gotten through me, which is not the spring but the plate. She says, 'If it has gotten through me, it will not be at the door anymore. It will be at wherever I am. It will be at my table, in my house, wherever I go,' she says. And I have not set a plate out anywhere for 5 years to see if the plate stays right. On the mornings when I set a plate on the step of this house and come back in the morning and find it empty with the cloth folded, I know the cloth is folded by what is in the hollow and what is in the spring, not by what is in me." She says, "I have set plates on the steps of 3 other houses, a cousin's house in Ozarks, the church steps, once, a woman's house in Harlan when I went there for supplies, and she was kind enough to let me put a plate on her step for the night. At the cousin's house and the church, the plates came back full in the morning. At the house in Harlan, the food was gone, but the cloth was not folded. It had blown around, the way a cloth blows in an ordinary wind." She says, "I think I am clean. I think what is in me is the hollow and not the thing, and the hollow is not the same as the thing, the way a house is not the same as what lives in it, and when I leave the hollow will go out of me, the way a chill goes out of you when you come in by a fire." She says, "I hope that," she says, "I am leaving tomorrow." And she did. On the morning of the 17th of February, 1921, Leora Sowell, 15 years old, packed what she could carry in a flour sack and walked out of Trace Creek Hollow on a February morning without looking back. She walked to the mouth of Trace Creek, and she turned onto the Clover Fork Road, and she walked 4 miles to Ozarks, and she got on a wagon going to Middlesboro, and she went. She did not say goodbye to Cora or Calhoun or Press or Denton. She got up at 4 in the morning while everyone was asleep, and she dressed in the dark, and she took her flour sack, and she went out the front door, not the back, not past the east wall, through the front door, and she walked down the hollow road in the February dark, and she counted. She counted her steps, out loud in her own head, from the front door to the mouth of the hollow, because counting was a thing she had learned from Cora, learned the way you learn superstitions, that turn out not to be superstitions, and she counted every step, 1,422 steps from the front door of the Sowell house to the place where Trace Creek Hollow opens onto the Clover Fork Road, and at 1,422 she stopped counting and she breathed in. Cold air. February. Cold. Coal smoke from somewhere down the Clover Fork. Creek water. The bare rock smell of the mountain in winter. Not copper. She kept walking. If you are still with me this far into the dark, drop a word in the comments. I want to know you are there. And I want to keep going, because there is still the matter of what happened in the hollow after Leora left, and the matter of what happened to Leora herself in the 40 years after, and the matter of the plates. Now then. Leora Sowell settled in Middlesboro, Kentucky. She worked first as a seamstress and then as a bookkeeper, and she had, by the accounts of everyone who knew her in Middlesboro, an almost preternatural stillness about her, the quality of a person who has learned to be quiet in ways that other people have not had occasion to learn. She married a man named Henry Boggs in 1927, a tobacco man, kind and ordinary, and she did not tell him about Trace Creek Hollow for 11 years, and when she told him, she did not tell him everything, and what she did tell him he received with the quiet of a man who loves a woman more than he needs to understand her. She wrote to Cora. Not often, not the way Cora had written to Hallie. Occasional letters, cautious letters, letters that told Cora where she was, and that she was well, and that asked after the family without asking too many questions, because she had decided that the less the Hollow knew about where she was, the better, and the letters were a conduit, a thin line of information running between where she was and where the Hollow was, and she was careful about what she put through it, Cora's letters back told her. Not everything. What Cora thought she should know. Calhoun died in 1923, 2 years after Leora left. He died at the spring. He was found there in the morning, sitting on the edge of the basin with his feet in the water, the same way he had been found the first time in 1915, but this time the cold had gotten into more than his legs, and he did not come back from it. He was 42 years old. The death record says heart failure, which is what it always says in those years, in those hollows, when the truth will not fit in the box. Cora kept the feeding, alone, after Calhoun died, with Press and Denton in the house. She kept the plate at the door every night, the cloth over it, and retrieved it in the morning with the cloth folded and the food gone. Press was 20 years old, and Denton was 12, and she had them and the farm and the feeding and the spring in the east wall and the second room where Luther had built and Calhoun had died, and she was 43 years old, and she kept going. She wrote to Leora in 1925 to say that Press was worse, not sick, just less. She wrote, "He eats at the spring now. I mean that literally. He takes his meals to the spring, and he eats there. I have stopped trying to stop him. I do not know what stopping would accomplish, that not stopping does not also accomplish." She wrote in 1926 to say that the garden was the best it had ever been, and she had not eaten from it in 3 years, and had told Denton not to eat from it. And Denton, who was 15, ate from it anyway, because 15-year-old boys in a hollow in 1926 are hungry, and the garden is there. She wrote in 1928 to say she was thinking about leaving. She wrote in 1929 to say she had not left. She wrote, "I cannot leave Press. I know what Amma Sizemore said about what staying means. I know that what is in the hollow does not hold me by force, and only holds me by my love for what is in it. I know that, and I know it, and I do not leave. Press is 26 years old, and he has not been past the mouth of the hollow in 3 years. He goes to the spring, and he comes back, and he does the work, and he is kind, and he is entirely himself, and he is entirely the hollow's, and I cannot leave him there alone with it. And then At the bottom of that letter, almost as an afterthought, one line. She writes, "Denton is different." That is the whole line. 4 words. She does not explain it in that letter, and she does not return to it in the next 2 letters, and I read those 3 letters 5 times before I understood she was not being cagey. She waited until she was certain of this. She was certain by 1932. The evidence needed no more words. She does not say how. She does not say what it means to be different. The next letter does not mention it. I have all 17 of the Cora letters, and I went back through them 3 times looking for more about what different meant with reference to Denton, and the next time Denton comes up in the letters is in 1932, and by then Cora does not need to explain what she meant in 29, because what Denton is by 1932 makes it clear. Denton's soul, by the time he was 21 years old, had the hollow the way Press had it, close and tight and tethered. But the way it was in Denton was not the same as it was in Press. Press had gone to the spring and made his own agreement in friendship, and what the spring had put in Press was a line that ran back to the spring so that Press could go nowhere. The line did not stretch, and the line did not stretch far. The line in Denton was different. It ran in the other direction. Denton's soul, from the time he was about 18 years old, was not staying in the hollow because he was pulled to it. He was staying in the hollow because he was, in some way, Cora found harder to describe than the way she described everything else necessary to it. She writes in 1932 that Press is kept here. Denton is keeping. I said I would tell you what that meant. You are going to want to sit with the answer, because it changes the shape of everything the family had been doing for more than 50 years. I have tried 4 times to write that clearly, and that is the closest I can get. Press is the one being held. Denton is the one holding. He is 19 years old, and he is in that second room every night, and he does not sleep the way sleeping sounds from outside a room. And the spring is quieter in these last 2 years than it has been in all the time I have been here. And I do not know if that is good. She writes, "The quiet is the thing that frightens me most. I have been frightened by the noise of this place for 30 years. The noise I understand. The noise is the working of the agreement doing what an agreement does. The quiet is something else. The quiet is the agreement not needing to work anymore. The quiet is what comes when the hollow has what it has been patient for." She writes, "I think Denton is the feeding now. I think the cloth at the door is not what is being fed. I think the cloth at the door is habit, and the habit is empty, and what the hollow is eating is Denton, and I do not know how to stop it, and I do not know how Denton feels about it, because I cannot get him to say, 'Can I stop this and ask you to sit with something?'" Patience Sowell put a plate outside the door in the winter of 1851 and told her 7-year-old son it was for the poor. She did it every night for 30 years. She did it carefully, in the dark, in secret, because she knew what the feeding was, and she knew it had to stay outside, and she kept it outside for 30 years, and then Luther opened the east wall. Bess Sowell did the year, and she got it back outside, and then she fed it for another 30 years. Cora Sowell took the feeding after Bess and fed it for 19 years, and then Press made his own agreement, and Denton started setting out the cloth beside his bed. And what Cora was saying in 1932 is that after 80 years of management, after 80 years of the plate and the cloth and the outside the door and the never at the table, what the hollow had arrived at was a member of the family, not a stranger at the table, not an agreement or a ritual or a management, a member of the family. It had eaten its way in, slowly, over 4 generations, through the garden and through the spring water and through the 2 months that Calhoun was in the house before Bess moved him, and through Press's friendship at the spring, and through Denton's cloth beside the bed, and through 80 years of the family's ordinary life in its ordinary air, breathing the hollow and eating the garden and drinking the spring-fed creek. And it had arrived at Denton. Leora Sowell, in Middlesbrough, received Cora's letter about Denton in 1932 and did not go back. She had made her promise to Amma Sizemore, and she had made her counting on the February morning, and she had her husband and her ordinary life, and 2 children of her own by then, a girl named Ruth and a boy named Cal, named for Calhoun in the way that mountain families name after the dead. And she did not go back, but she started checking herself again. Not the plates, not the cloths. That practice had lapsed in her decade in Middlesbrough, because the years had gone quiet and ordinary, and she had begun to feel, the way you feel things in good decades, that the danger was behind her, and the distance was enough. She started checking by smell again. Every morning before the sun was up, out the back door of her house in Middlesbrough, breathing in, looking for copper. She writes about this in the statement she gave the folklorist in 1944. She says, "For the first 11 years in Middlesbrough, I did not check. I was clean and I knew it, the way you know when a cold has passed out of you. And then Cora's letter came about Denton and I did not go back, and I started checking again." She says, "For 7 years I checked every morning, and I was clean every morning. And then one morning in the fall of 1939, I went outside and breathed in, and I stopped." She says, "It was faint, very faint, the way the first smell of a thing is always fainter than it will become. But it was there, old copper, dry metal, not the hollows smell, deeper than the hollows smell. The thing under the hollows smell, the thing that had been in the east wall when Reuben was a boy and had pressed his ear to it." She says, "I went inside, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about it for a long time." She says, "And I thought about what Amma Sizemore had said, that if I had brought it through me, rather than leaving it in the hollow, she could tell me how to manage it." She says, "But Amma Sizemore was, by 1939, not a person I knew how to find. I had not been back to Harlan County in 18 years. I did not know if she was alive. I did not know if she would be what I remembered, or the same kind of what I remembered, because what I remembered was a woman who had been old in a way no one could account for, and who had known Willa's grandmother's line by name, and who had said she had made most of the first agreements in the beginning, and that was not the account of an ordinary person, and I was not going to assume she was findable in an ordinary way." She says, "So I did what she had told me. I managed it the way you manage something that has come through you, instead of through a place. And the way you manage that, she had told me, is this." She says, "You feed it at your threshold, but your threshold is your own body now, not a doorstep. You keep it outside by keeping yourself between it and everything you love. You do not let it reach through you to the people you are with. You are the door now. You are the east wall, and you are thicker than Patience made hers. And you hold the line that she held, and you say your own name out loud every morning so that you know which side of the door your name is on." She says, "I have been doing that since 1939 every morning. My own name, out loud. So I know which side I am on." And then the folklorist asks her how she knows it is working. And Leora says, in the transcript, with a slight change in the quality of the transcription that I read as a smile, though I cannot be sure. She says, "My husband does not smell of copper. My daughter does not smell of copper. My son, who is named for his grandfather in that hollow, does not smell of copper. And I smell of it only a little in the early mornings, before I say my name." She says, "I think I am the door, and the door is holding, and the door will hold as long as I hold it." She says, "I think when I die, the door opens." That is the part I have not solved. She was 38 years old in 1944. She lived to be 72. She died in 1978 in Middlesbrough, in her own bed, in her own house, with her daughter Ruth and her son Cal in the house. Henry Boggs had died in 1961. She had kept the mornings for 39 years, and she had kept the door. What happened in the hours after she died is in Ruth's account of it, which is in a letter that Ruth wrote to her own daughter in 1992, prompted by a smell her daughter had reported waking up to one morning in an apartment in Cincinnati. Ruth writes, "Your grandmother died on the 17th of April, 1978, at about 4 in the morning. I was in the room. Cal was in the house, asleep down the hall." She writes, "In the last hour before she died, she said my name, and she said Cal's name, and she said your grandfather's name, though he had been gone 17 years, and she said the names the way you say names you are counting, not tenderly, not in farewell, methodically, making sure of something." She writes, "And at the moment she died I smelled something. I am sure of it. I know what you will think of that. I know how it sounds, but I smelled something. In that room, at that moment, that I had not smelled before, and have not smelled since. And the smell was old metal, the smell of old copper, and it was faint, and it was there, and it was gone in about 3 breaths." She writes, "And then I went and got Cal, and Cal came to the room, and we sat with her, and in the morning we called the doctor, and that was that." She writes, "I am telling you this because you wrote about the smell in your apartment in Cincinnati, and because your grandmother told me once, the year before she died, that there was something she had been holding for 40 years, and that when she stopped holding it, it would go somewhere." She writes, "I think it went to Cincinnati." She writes, "I think it went to you." The daughter is now 64 years old. She lives in Columbus. I know this because I looked for her. I am not going to name her, because she did not ask to be in this story, and I do not believe in naming people who did not consent to it. But I will tell you what I know about her, which is that she has lived in Ohio for 40 years, and she is healthy, and she has children and grandchildren, and a house that smells of an ordinary house. And I will tell you that when I wrote to her, carefully, without explaining too much in the first letter, she wrote back within a week, and in her reply she said 3 things. She said, "Yes, I remember the smell in Cincinnati." She said, "I do not smell it now, and I have not for many years." And she said, "I still set a plate out on my back step some nights. I do not know why. My mother started it when I was a child, just a habit she had, and I picked it up, and I have done it for 50 years, and the food is always gone in the morning, and the cloth is always folded. The cloth is always folded. Trace Creek Hollow is still there. The county road has been paved since the 60s. I drove it in November, in the same November I spent at the Harlan County Historical Society, and I turned off at the point where the county road meets the Hollow Road, and I sat with the engine running and the window down for about 10 minutes. The hollow smelled of cold water and wet sandstone, and something older and drier and deeper, the way old rooms smell of what has been in them longer than the room has been. I did not go in. Now I want to go back, because there is a part of the soul account that I have been holding back, not to deceive you, but to hold it for the moment when its weight would be most useful, and that moment is now. It is the matter of what was in the spring basin on the morning of the 14th of February, 1878. That is the morning after Willa arrived in the hollow, after she had spoken with Bess, after she had decided to ride to Amma Sizemore, before she rode. She went to the spring that morning, in the February cold, before anyone else was up, because she wanted to see it herself. She had heard about the spring all her life, in the stories her mother had told her, and in the descriptions Reuben had given her when she visited him in Ozarks. But she had not been in the hollow since she was a young woman, and she had not, in those early years, known enough about the spring to know what she was looking at. She went at first light, alone, in the February cold, And she stood at the edge of the basin, and she looked. The water was the right color, the right temperature, running correctly out over the lip into the ground. The basin was cut sandstone, the same age as everything else, settled and mossy. The surface of the water was still, the way the water always held still in that hollow. And in the surface of the water she saw her own face looking up at her, which was ordinary, which is what water does, which is what any basin does. And beside her face in the water, slightly behind her left shoulder, a face she did not recognize. She was alone. She had come alone, and she had walked up to the basin without turning her back on the house, and she had not passed anyone or heard anyone. She was alone at the basin in the February cold at first light. She did not move. She looked at the face in the water, and it looked back, and it was not her face, and it was not Creel's face in the way she had been told. Creel had no face you could hold. It was a face that was very still and very patient, and interested in her in the way that things with no hunger of their own are interested in things that have hunger, with a clean, unsentimental curiosity about what the hungry thing was going to do. She said, later, to Reuben, that it looked at her the way a landlord looks at a tenant who is late on the rent. Not angry, not threatening, simply present and waiting, and entirely clear about the ownership of the property. She stepped back from the basin. The face in the water did not move to follow her. It did not look away. It simply stayed, the way a thing stays when it does not need to chase you because it already knows where you live. She rode to Amma Sizemore's. Now, there is a thing I want you to understand about that face, because it is the thing the whole account is pointing toward, and it is the thing that makes the cloth always folded so disturbing in a way that goes beyond the folding. The cloth is always folded, not disturbed, not scattered, not half unfolded or dragged about the step, folded in the same fold every morning. For 4 generations, through Patience and Bess and Cora, and through Leora in Middlesboro, and through Ruth, and through the granddaughter in Columbus. A fold is not an act of hunger. A fold is an act of acknowledgement. You fold something because you are signaling that you have received it, that you know what it is, that you are keeping your part of the agreement. You fold something the way you countersign a contract. It folds the cloth, because it is telling whoever puts out the plate that it received the plate, and it is keeping the agreement, and the agreement continues every morning, without fail. Whether it is at the door of the Sowell House in Trace Creek Hollow in 1862, or at the back step of a house in Columbus, Ohio, in the 21st century, it has never once not folded the cloth. In 150 years of the agreement, across every generation of the Sowell line and into a lineage that does not even carry the Sowell name anymore, it has never once not folded the cloth. That is a patient thing. That is an old agreement. That is a thing that has been keeping its end for 150 years without any of the people on the other end of it fully understanding what the agreement says. And the only person who ever came close to understanding it was a 10-year-old girl on a February morning in 1916, riding 8 miles to ask an old woman what the hollow wanted, and the old woman told her, and the telling was a single word: continuance. It wants to continue. It wants the family to continue, and the feeding to continue, and the line to continue, and the hollow to continue, and itself to continue in the hollow. And what it has spent 150 years building is exactly that. A family who feeds it, across distance now, across generations, across names. The cloth folds on a back step in Columbus, and the hollow continues, and the thing in the hollow continues, and the spring runs the right color into a basin that was cut before the county existed, and the agreement continues. That is what a hungry place wants. Not your food, your presence, your generations, your blood memory of the shape of the agreement, so deep in you that your grandmother's granddaughter, who has never been to Kentucky and does not know the story, puts a plate on a step on a certain kind of evening without knowing why. It gets into the habit, and the habit is the agreement, and the agreement is the feeding, and the feeding is the family, and the family is the hollow, and the hollow is patient. I said I was going to tell you what was written on that board in the schoolhouse story. That was a different story. I gave you this one instead. I think you understand why. But I do want to tell you one more thing, and then I am going to tell you about the one small wrongness in this case that has kept me up more than any of the large ones, because the large ones are documented and can be thought about and can be filed and considered and kept at a professional distance. The small one is not like that. The small one is the kind that gets in under the door of the mind and stays. It is about the fold. In the spring of 1942, Ruth Boggs, who was then 18 years old and living in her mother's house in Middlesbrough, and had known all her life about the plate and the cloth on the back step, though not why, came in one morning from checking the step and told her mother something. She told her mother that the cloth had been folded differently, not the same fold, a different fold, not sloppily different, not the fold of something that had made a mistake or was less careful than usual, a precise, deliberate, different fold, the way you would fold something differently if you were trying to show that you knew a different way, that the usual fold was a choice and not a limit. Leora said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Folded how?" And Ruth showed her, taking a cloth from the kitchen drawer and folding it the way the step cloth had been folded, and Leora looked at it for a long time. And then she said, in the careful voice she used when she was being most exact, which Ruth recognized and had learned to pay attention to, "That is how my mother folded the tablecloth." When she set the table on Sunday, Patience Sowell had been dead since 1885. Bess Sowell, who had grown up in that hollow and taken over the plate from Patience, had been dead since 1909. Neither of them had ever been to Middlesbrough. Neither of them had ever stood in Leora's kitchen or touched Leora's cloths or been within 130 miles of that step. The cloth on the step in the spring of 1942 had been folded the way that Patience Sowell had folded a tablecloth, a specific and individual fold, 50 years after Patience died, and 130 miles from where Patience had ever lived. It remembered her. It had known her the way it knew the face in the spring basin, the way it knew Willa's name without being told, the way it had learned Naomi Thorne's humming and Ivy Pettigrew's hum, and the Pettigrew twins' stride, and the shape of the loss in every family it had ever sat down across the table from. It remembered Patience, who had kept it outside for 30 years, who had been its keeper and its manager and its adversary and its provider, who had made the original modern agreement and tended it until she could not any more. It remembered her the way you remember the person who fed you, and after 70 years and 130 miles, in the spring of 1942, it folded a cloth in her fold and left it on a step in Kentucky to say, "I remember," to say, "I am still here," to say, "The agreement continues." And now I am going to tell you what is in the hollow today. Not the spring, not the second room, not the east wall. What is in the people? What is in the line? Because the granddaughter in Columbus is not the end of the Sowell line. She has children. She has grandchildren. They are ordinary people, some in Ohio, some in Kentucky, some elsewhere, the way families spread. They do not, most of them, know about Trace Creek Hollow. They do not know about Patience, or the plate, or the year, or what Amma Sizemore said. But some of them put out plates. Not all. Some. I know this because the granddaughter in Columbus told me, in the letter she wrote back. She said not all of her children do it, and she does not know why some do and some do not. She said she has never taught them to do it. She has done it in front of them all their lives, the way Cora did it in front of Press and Leora and Denton, and the way it passed to some and not others in that generation It passes to some and not others in this one, she said. My youngest daughter does it, my oldest son does not, my middle daughter does not. My youngest daughter's daughter, who is 7 years old and has never been told about any of this, puts out a small piece of food from her dinner every night on a napkin on the floor of her room, and in the morning the food is always gone. She says, I found out about the napkin last year. I found it by accident, going into her room at night for something. I did not say anything. I stood in the doorway and I watched her put it out, very carefully, and she put it on the floor and she smoothed the napkin the way you smooth a cloth. And she said something I could not hear, and she looked up and saw me in the door, and she was not frightened and she was not embarrassed. She was perfectly calm, she says. She said, I am feeding it. She said it the way you say, I am setting the table. Ordinary, informational, just answering the question she saw on my face. She says, I asked her who told her to do that. She said nobody. She said she just knows. She just knows. A 7-year-old in Columbus, Ohio, 150 years after the first winter in Trace Creek Hollow, feeding something in her room at night with a piece of her dinner on a napkin on the floor, the way Denton fed it with the cloth beside his bed, and Patience fed it with the plate at the door, and every woman in that line fed it in the shape the family knew, which was the shape of the agreement, which is the shape that gets into the habit, which is the shape that is now the blood memory. I said at the beginning that this story does not make sense as a haunting. I said it only makes sense as something else. And I want to say now what I think the something else is, because I have been going around this for most of a year, and I believe I have arrived at the edge of it, though not the center. I think a hungry place is not a ghost, and it is not a monster. Those are words for things that are human-shaped. And this is not human-shaped, it is hollow-shaped, and the shape of a hollow is an absence, a place where something is not, and the absence is old, and it is patient. And it is not malicious any more than a river is malicious when it cuts a canyon. The river cuts the canyon because it is water, and water goes downhill, and the canyon is what happens over time when water goes downhill in the same place. The hollow gets into the family because it is hungry, and the family is there, and the family is what happens over time when a hungry place and a family occupy the same ground. It is not evil. It is not good. It is very old, and it is very patient, and it is kept alive by the agreement, and the agreement is kept alive by the habit, and the habit is kept alive by the women of the family who know enough to know it must be kept and not quite enough to know how to end it, and none of them have ever known how to end it, because Amma Sizemore, who might have known, never said that part, and if she said it to someone who did not survive to pass it on. Patience said, I have kept the feeding as long as I can. The keeping now belongs to the next one. Lord, let the next one be steady enough. Bess was steady enough. Cora was steady enough. Leora was steady enough to leave, which is its own kind of steadiness. And there is a 7-year-old in Columbus who is steady enough to know what she is feeding without being told, and she smooths the napkin the way you smooth a cloth, and the food is always gone in the morning. I do not know if she will be told. I do not know if the telling would help. I have written the account you have just heard, and I have sent it to the woman in Columbus, and she has read it, or she has started to read it, and whether she finishes it, or what she does with it if she does, is not mine to know. But I have one more thing to tell you before we reach the end, and it is the smallest thing in this account, and it is the hardest thing in this account, and it is the reason I drove up to that hollow road in November, and sat with the window down, and breathed in, and did not go in. It is about what happened on the day I left the Harlan County Historical Society, the second day, the day I finished reading the Cora letters. I left in the late afternoon. I had been in that room for 2 days, in a basement in Harlan, reading the letters in gray archival boxes, and I was tired the way you are tired after reading something that takes something out of you, and I walked to my car in the courthouse parking lot in November, cold, and I sat in the car for a moment before starting it, and I smelled something. It was faint, very faint, the way the first smell of a thing is always fainter than it will become. Old metal, dry and faint and old. I sat in the car in the courthouse parking lot in Harlan, Kentucky, and I breathed in, and I thought about Leora going to the back door every morning before the sun was up, and I thought about the 7-year-old smoothing her napkin on the floor of her room in Columbus, and I thought about the cloth always folded in the same fold, and I sat there for a while. And then I decided what I decided, which is that I had been in a basement room for 2 days reading about one thing and breathing the particular air of old paper and old rooms, and that the smell of old paper and old rooms is not unlike the smell of old metal, and that I was tired, and that the decision to be a rational person is a decision you make fresh every morning, and I had made it that morning, and I was making it again. I started the car. I drove north out of Harlan. I stopped at a diner 8 miles up the road, and I ate a full meal because I had not eaten since morning, and the food arrived somewhere, and I paid, and I got back in the car. And at no point between the courthouse parking lot and the diner and the drive north did I check to see if the smell came with me. I am telling you that honestly. I did not check. I made a decision, and the decision is that some agreements are not mine to know about, and the not knowing is the boundary, and the boundary holds as long as I do not look over it. That is what I tell myself. Let me bring you back to the documents, because I owe you the ending of the Sowell family, properly told, and I have been telling it to you from the outside when the inside is where the weight is. What happened to, I told you we would come back to Press. Here is what the record says. Press Sowell is in the county death records. He died in the summer of 1947 in the hollow at the spring. He was 44 years old. He had not left the hollow in 20 years. The county record says he drowned, which is technically possible in 4 feet of water if a man is not well, and Press had not been well in the way that the Sowell family was not well, which is to say, he had been less for so long that the less had arrived at an end. The death record has one unusual detail, noted by the deputy who went in to file the paperwork, a detail that the deputy wrote down only because he was a thorough man and he wrote down what he saw. He wrote that the basin of the spring, which was cut sandstone, approximately 4 feet deep, had water in it of the correct color and temperature, running normally out over the lip. He wrote that the deceased was found at the basin and not in it. He wrote one additional line, and then he crossed it out, which means you can still read it if you look at the photostatic copy, and what he wrote and crossed out was that the basin floor appears lined with cloth folded in one layer. Basin floor appears lined with cloth folded in one layer. He crossed it out. He wrote the rest of the report. He filed it. He went home. Cora Sowell died in the hollow in 1949, in the same bed where Calhoun had died at 69 years old of pneumonia, which is the same thing that had taken Bess, which is the thing that takes the women of that hollow when the winters are finally enough. She had outlasted Calhoun by 26 years, and she had outlasted Press by 2, and she had kept the feeding for 48 years, which is longer than Patience and longer than Bess, though not by much, and she had done it with less instruction than either of them and less support than any of them. Her last letter to Hallie Fry, dated the October before she died, is 2 pages long, and it is mostly ordinary. News of the county. The garden that year. The fall coming in early, and at the end, in the small, close hand that her letters had acquired over 40 years of writing about things she did not want the letter to carry too much of, she writes. She writes, Denton has left. He left in August, and I do not know where he is. He did not tell me he was going, and he did not say goodbye, which is what he was told to do by whoever told him to do it, and I am not angry. I am something else. I do not have a name for it. I am the feeling of a lock for which the key has been removed. She writes, "The feeding continues. I do not know what I am feeding at this point. Press is gone. Calhoun is gone. Leora is far away and has been for 30 years. Denton is somewhere I do not know, and I am an old woman in a hollow. And every night I put a plate at the door, and every morning the cloth is folded and the food is gone." She writes, "I will keep doing it, because stopping it, after 48 years, seems to me worse than continuing. The way stopping a river seems worse than letting it run. And because Patience kept it for 30 years alone, and Bess kept it for 30 years alone, and I see no reason why I cannot do the same," she writes. "Though I am 68, and the winters are getting longer, and I am not as certain of the mornings as I once was," she writes, "give my love to your people. Tell your granddaughter that the mountains are beautiful in October, and that if she comes this way she should stay on the Clover Fork Road." She writes, "Do not come into Trace Creek Hollow. There is nothing in it now for anybody to find." That is the last of the Cora letters. She died the following February. Denton Sowell is the part of the story I have been least able to complete. He left in August of 1949. He was 38 years old. He had been in the Hollow all his life, and had not left it since he was old enough to stay, and then one day in August he was gone, without a word, without a goodbye, which is the right way to leave the Hollow, and he would have known that. I have found one record of him after the Hollow. He appears in a Harlan County voter registration for 1950, living in Harlan, not in Trace Creek. He appears in a Social Security record from 1953 with an address in Whitley County. He does not appear in any subsequent records I have found, which could mean he died young, or changed his name, or moved out of state, or 3 other things I have thought of, and 2 I have not. But his daughter found me. That is the right way to say it, I think. About 6 months after I had begun writing up this case, a woman contacted me through the address on my research page, and she said she had found my inquiry in the Harlan County Historical Society archives, the inquiry I had left there with my contact information in case anyone with Sowell family connections came in. She said her father had been a Sowell from Harlan County, and she wanted to know why I was looking. I wrote back carefully. "The way you write back to someone when you are not sure yet what they know." She wrote, "I know about the Hollow. My father told me before he died. He told me the whole thing, or what he had of the whole thing, which was not everything, because nobody ever had everything." She wrote, "He left because Cora died. He left when he understood she was going to die, and before she actually died because he needed the leaving to happen before the grief. He said the grief would have kept him. He said a hungry place does not hold you by force, it holds you by your love for what is in it. And he loved Cora, and he could not leave while she was alive, and so he left when he knew, while she was still alive, in August, and he did not say goodbye, and he never went back." She wrote, "He said he could feel the tether for 20 years after he left, not strongly enough to pull him back, but strong enough to feel, the way you feel the weight of a thing you used to carry in the muscles of your arms when your arms are empty." She wrote, "He set out a plate every night for the rest of his life. He said it was not because the thing was near him. He said it was the habit. He said once you have kept the feeding long enough, it becomes part of the structure of a day, the way eating is part of the structure of a day, and stopping it would have been like deciding not to eat, a gap in the shape of the day that would have been felt as a loss, not a relief." She wrote, "He died in 1986. He was 75 years old. He lived in Tennessee the last 20 years of his life, in a house in Claiborne County, a good house, and he died in it in his own bed in the spring. And I was there, and my children were there." She wrote, And the morning after he died, before the funeral home came, I went out to the back step where he always put the plate. And the plate was there, and the cloth was on it. And I lifted the cloth. She wrote, "The plate was full. The plate was full." She wrote, "I do not know what that means. I have been carrying that for 38 years, and I do not know what it means. Whether it means the agreement was ended when he died and the thing stopped receiving it, or whether it means the thing was no longer there, having moved somewhere else, or whether it means something else entirely that I do not have the instruction for." She wrote, "He never folded the cloth. In 40 years of putting out the plate, he never folded the cloth. He said he did not know how to fold it the right way, and he would rather not fold it wrong." She wrote, "But the morning after he died, the cloth on the full plate was folded." She wrote, "It was folded the way he had told me once his great-grandmother had folded the tablecloth on Sundays." And I sat with that for a very long time, because what she was describing was what Ruth Boggs had described in 1942 and what Leora Boggs had recognized as patience soul's fold, the same fold. 78 years later, on a back step in Claiborne County, Tennessee, with Denton Soul, 3 days dead and a full plate that had not been touched, the same fold. It remembered patience on the day that the last soul who had been born in the hollow died. It folded the cloth in her fold, on a full plate, on a back step, in Tennessee, in the spring, to say, "I was here," to say, "I remember," to say, "The agreement is not ended." Before I give you my final accounting of what I know and do not know, I want to spend some time with Adeline Pratt, because she has not gotten her full due in this account, and she deserves it. She came to Trace Creek Hollow in the fall of 1891 as the district school teacher, 22 years old, fresh from a normal school in eastern Kentucky, and she was warned, in the way that new teachers were warned in that county in those years, which is to say, she was told almost nothing and given to understand she was not expected to ask. She taught the Hollow children for 6 years, and she kept a diary for all 6 years, and the diary is in the collection of the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort, donated in 1949 by her niece, catalogued as the papers of one Adeline Pratt, teacher, Harlan County. The catalog entry says, "Personal Diary, 6 volumes, 1891 to 1897, primarily concerning teaching duties in Harlan County, Kentucky." Primarily. That word is doing the work of a long silence. Adeline Pratt noticed things. That is the quality that makes her diary valuable beyond what she knew, which is that she noticed things and wrote them down without knowing what she was noticing, which means her account is not shaped by what she understood, but only by what she saw, and an account shaped only by what was visible rather than what was understood is a different kind of evidence than any of the other evidence in this case. Cora knew. Leora knew. Patience knew. They wrote from inside the knowledge. Adeline Pratt wrote from outside it, which means she noticed the things the insiders had stopped noticing because they had been inside too long. She noticed, for instance, that the Soul Garden was remarkable. She mentions it in her diary in the fall of 1892, not as a horror but as an observation that the Sowell's kitchen garden produces more than it should, given the light the hollow gets. And Mrs. Sowell does not eat from it at dinner, a fact Adeline noted because she ate with the family twice that fall, and both times Bess Sowell served from the garden and ate only what came from cans or from the cold box. She wrote, "Mrs. Sowell is the strangest combination of hospitable and careful that I have ever encountered in a kitchen. She feeds her table magnificently and does not eat what she has cooked. I asked if she was unwell, and she said she ate earlier. I said it twice on different visits, and both times she said she ate earlier. She did not eat earlier. A woman who runs a kitchen like that eats with her table. She noticed the way Calhoun moved through the hollow. She wrote that passage I quoted earlier, "The hollow walks around him," in her second year, and she wrote it not in the context of the supernatural, but in the context of a meditation on belonging, on what it means to be native to a place, which she was thinking about because she herself was from Bell County, and felt, even after a year, like a visitor in Trace Creek. She contrasted her own foreignness with Calhoun's rootedness, and arrived at the line about the hollow walking around him not because she thought it was eerie, but because she thought it was simply true, and it was only in retrospect, reading her own entry 2 years later, that she wrote in the margin beside it, "I have been thinking about this again, and I believe I said it wrong the first time. It is not that the hollow walks around him, it is that they are the same thing, and the walking is how you can see that." And she noticed what no one else in this case noticed, because no one else was an outsider with a teacher's habit of counting. She counted the children, not the Soul children specifically. She counted all the children who came to her school from the hollow, which in any given year was between 9 and 14, from the several families who lived in Trace Creek and the adjacent drains. She counted them, and she kept attendance in the methodical way of someone who had been trained to keep attendance. And she noticed, in her third year, that the attendance from Trace Creek was different from the attendance of children from elsewhere in the county in one specific way. Children are absent. That is the ordinary state of children in a rural county school in 1893. They are absent for weather, and they are absent for work, and they are absent for sickness, and they are absent for reasons no one ever writes down. The pattern of absences at Adeline Pratt School for the children who did not live in Trace Creek was random, scattered across the calendar, concentrated in planting and harvest, heavier in bad weather, lighter in good. The pattern of absences for children from Trace Creek was different. The Trace Creek children were almost never absent in spring. They were almost never absent in summer. They were absent in winter, in December and January and February, and sometimes into March, at a rate that was not quite high enough to require county inquiry, but was high enough for Adeline Pratt to notice by the third year, when she had enough data to see it. She wrote about it in the spring of 1894. She writes that she had been through the registers for 3 years, her own and those left by previous teachers, and had found a pattern in the Trace Creek attendance she could not account for. The Trace Creek families were most reliably present from March through November, the warm half of the year, and least present in the cold half, December through February. She writes, "I have asked Mrs. Soul about this, and she says winter roads and illness, which is the answer any parent gives, and I accept it for what it is, which is an answer that closes the question rather than addressing it." She writes, "What I cannot reconcile is this. Other families from equally remote parts of the district have the same winter roads and the same winter illness, and they are not absent in the pattern the Trace Creek children are. The winter absences from Trace Creek are not random. They are, when I plot them, concentrated in the weeks immediately following the first hard cold of the season, and they ease as winter deepens. They are worst, not at the coldest, but at the onset, as if the beginning of the cold is the disturbance, and the family adjusts to it, and by February they have adjusted and the children come back. She does not understand what she has found, but what she has found is the pattern of the feeding. What she has found is the period each year when the agreement is most active, when the thing at the door is most hungry, because the cold has arrived and the warm season's ease is gone, and the families in the hollow are most concentrated on managing it, and the children stay home, not because of winter roads, because every adult in the hollow in the first weeks of the cold is focused on the plate and the cloth and the threshold, and the children stay close. Adeline Pratt taught in Trace Creek Hollow for 6 years, and she went home to Bell County in 1897, and she became a bookkeeper which is what you did with a teacher's skills in Bell County in 1897 if you wanted to stay in Bell County, and she kept the diary, all 6 volumes. And she died in 1943, and the diary went to the Historical Society. And here is the last Adeline Pratt detail I want to give you, because it is small and it has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this case. In the last entry of the last volume of her diary, written on the day she left the Hollow in June of 1897, she writes about the morning of her departure, about packing her things and loading the wagon that was taking her out. She writes that Bess Sowell came out of the house at about 6 in the morning and stood in the yard while Adeline loaded the wagon, and that Bess did not help and did not offer to help, which was unusual, because Bess Sowell was a woman who offered to help with everything. She writes, Mrs. Sowell stood in the yard and watched me load, and when I was done and I went to her to say goodbye, she took my hand and she held it for a moment, and then she said, "You never ate the garden." And Adeline says she said no, she never had. The commute to the store being only 4 miles, and she had always had her own supplies, and Bess said, that was good, and Adeline said she did not know what to make of that and said so. And Bess said, "You came in as a stranger, and you are leaving as a stranger, and that is the best way to leave this place." And then she let go of Adeline's hand, and she went back into the house, and Adeline drove out of the Hollow. She never went back. She said so in the diary. She wrote, "I am glad that I never ate the garden. I do not know why I am glad. I have been here for 6 years, and I do not know why I am glad. Only that I am. And that Mrs. Sowell's face when she said it was the face of a woman telling me something important in the only way she could manage. That was Bess Sowell in 1897, who had kept the plate at the door for 17 years by then, who had done the year, who had moved the baby and brought him back and watched him grow into the Hollow and kept on feeding. She stood in her yard in June and told the schoolteacher she was glad she was leaving as a stranger, and the gladness in her voice was the gladness of a woman who had seen what happened when you did not leave as a stranger, and who was, for one stranger who had gotten clear, briefly grateful. There are things I have not been able to find. I want to name them plainly, because I do not want you to think this account is complete when it is not. I have not found what happened to Calhoun's other siblings, the ones who left the Hollow before the thing arrived. Elam, who went to Whitley County and stayed. Dorcas, who went to Bell County and took the baby. Whether the Hollow reached them, whether the copper smell went with them, or stopped at the mouth of the Hollow, whether their grandchildren set out plates, the record does not say. I have not found Alma Sizemore. I have looked. I have looked in census records and church records and county records going back to 1840, and I have found no one by that name in Harlan County or the adjacent counties who fits the description, which is to say, a woman who was old in 1878 and the same old in 1916, and who had made the first agreements in the beginning. I have found nothing. I will tell you what I think, and I will tell it you plainly, because you have been with me for most of 180 minutes, and you deserve plain. I think that if you are the kind of person who makes agreements with hollow places and keeps them so long that the hollow places tell you things, and you tell the families of the hollow places what the hollow places are, you do not leave much of a paper record. You are not on the census. You are not in the church records. You are the kind of knowledge that exists outside the written record, and that is why most of what we know about this case is what the women of the Sowell line passed to each other, and why the passing was always incomplete, because the full instruction was with someone who was not writing it down. I have not found what is in the basin of the Trace Creek spring today. I have not been in the Hollow. I drove to the mouth of the Hollow Road, and I sat with the window down, and I breathed in, and I decided not to go in. And I am telling you, that decision was a rational decision made by a rational person on the basis of rational evidence. And I am also telling you that I do not fully believe that, and I do not think you should either. and I have not found the end. Not because the record runs out. The record runs out at various points, as records do, but I have enough of it stitched together from enough sources to tell the shape of the thing. I have not found the end because I do not think there is an end. I think what Amma Sizemore said is true, which is that you cannot feed a hungry thing to satisfaction, you can only feed it to patience. And patience is not an end. Patience is a duration, and a duration without an end is not a story with a conclusion, it is a condition, and the condition is ongoing, and the condition is in the habit of the 7-year-old in Columbus smoothing her napkin, and it is in the fold of the cloth on a full plate in Tennessee in the spring of 1986. And it is in the granddaughter who put the plate on the step in Harlan on a certain kind of evening without knowing why. And it is in whatever it is that gets into certain families and stays, that has been in that family since 1851 and before, since whoever it was before Pole Combs that Pole Combs got the instruction from, since the first agreement, which Amma Sizemore said she had made in the beginning when it was possible to make first agreements. In the beginning, when it was possible to make first agreements, which implies a time when it was not yet possible, which implies a time before the agreements, which implies a first moment of contact, which implies something that was hungry before there was anyone to feed it, which implies a hollow that was hollow for a very long time before the Combs family came up the mountain and the Sowell family built against the east wall, and Bess Sowell opened the door on a cold December night because a man was cold and needed feeding. And that is the last piece I want to give you, because it is the piece that, more than any other, has kept me up. It is not about the Sowells. It is about the land records. Trace Creek Hollow is listed in the Harlan County Land Records for the first time in 1844, when a survey was done of the county for the purposes of establishing deed records. The survey shows Trace Creek Hollow as an unimproved parcel, no structures, no clearing, no resident available for claim. And here is the detail that I found not in the survey itself, but in the surveyor's notes, which are held separately from the deed records in a different part of the courthouse, in a box that I only got to on my second day because I had asked about everything and a clerk had gone looking and found them. The surveyor's notes for Trace Creek Hollow, dated August 1844, written by a man named Hanlon, read as follows. He writes, "Hollow approximately 2 miles in length. Spring on east wall. No sign of prior occupation. That is the normal boilerplate. No sign of prior occupation." And then, beneath it, in a different ink and a different hand, which would mean it was added later, probably by Hanlon at the end of the day rather than in the field, there is one additional line. It reads, "Exception, spring basin is cut. Old work. Pre-county." The basin was cut before the county existed. Not recent cutting, not by a prior family, not by the Combs or anyone else the county could account for. Old work, pre-county. Somebody cut that basin before Harlan County was a county, before the white settlement came up the Cumberland River Road, in a time when the hollow was empty, when no one was there. Something cut the basin, and then the hollow waited. For a very long time it waited, in the patient way of hollow places, until someone came who needed a spring at 4 feet, where they did not have to dig, and built close enough to it that the 30 feet was not quite enough, and fed a stranger in the cold, and let the stranger stay. Pole Combs came up from the Carolinas in the 1790s and told her daughter the instruction, and Harney Combs told Patience, and Patience kept the feeding for 30 years. And everything I have told you tonight flows from that first winter, that first plate, that first cloth folded in the dark outside a door in 1851. But the basin was already there. Whatever wanted feeding was there before the first feeding. It had been patient before patience. It had been there, in the east wall of a hollow in what would become Harlan County, Kentucky, with a basin cut by nobody the county could account for, waiting for the ordinary hunger of a family that needed a spring. and it is still there. And the spring runs right, and the cloth is always folded. I want to spend the last part of this with you on something I do not usually do, which is to step back from the documents and the records and the careful sourcing and the honest accounting of what I do not know, and to tell you what I think. I have been working on this case for 3 years. I have read the letters so many times that I can tell you which of the 17 is which by the first sentence. I know how Cora writes when she is frightened, and how she writes when she has decided something, and how she writes on the Sundays when the afternoon has given her some room, and she is, for an hour, lighter, like a window being opened. I have thought about what the hollow is, and I have thought about what Amma Sizemore is, and I have thought about whether the thing that pressed its ear to the east wall when Reuben was a boy, and the thing that wore a man's shape and ate everything Bess put in front of it, and never filled out, and the thing that folded the cloth in Patience's fold on a back step in Tennessee are the same thing or different things, or whether those categories apply at all to something that old. Here is what I think. I think the hollow is not malicious, and it is not good, and it is not a ghost. I think it is a form of appetite so old it has forgotten what it is hungry for, and that the feeding works because the feeding is a form of presence, and presence is what it needs, and it has been patient enough to wait through all the generations of people who have had the instruction and all the generations who have not, because patient is what it is, and it has been patient for longer than the county, and longer than the settlement, and longer than the agreement, and it will be patient for longer than the granddaughter's granddaughter and the 7-year-old's grandchildren. And the only question it is asking, the only question it has ever been asking, is a question so basic it barely qualifies as a question. The question is whether there is someone there, and the family has been answering yes for 150 years. Yes, in the form of the plate. Yes, in the form of the cloth. Yes, in the form of the habit so deep in the blood that a 7-year-old in Columbus, who has never been told, does it anyway because the not doing would feel like the wrong kind of absence. That is not horror in the way we usually use the word. It is horror in the older way. The way that old things are horrible, not because they are evil, but because they are so much larger and older and more patient than we are. And because the enormity of that patience, when you press your ear to the east wall and feel it being very still in there, feels like looking over a cliff at something that does not look back, but knows you are there. That is Trace Creek Hollow. That is the Sowell family. That is the basin cut by nobody the county could account for, and the spring that runs the right color, and the cloth that is always folded. I have one last question to ask you. You have been with me for nearly 3 hours. You came in out of whatever evening you were in, and you made yourself comfortable, and you have been at this table with me for nearly 3 hours. And somewhere in the last 3 hours, if you are the kind of person who listens to stories like this in the dark, you may have gotten a snack, a glass of something, a bowl of something. You may have eaten at whatever serves you as a table tonight. And if the thing in that hollow is what I think it is, what it does is not haunt and not possess and not chase. It is patient. It listens for the presence. It reaches toward ordinary life in ordinary houses, through the blood of people who do not know they are carrying it, through the habit of people who put things out without knowing why. And what I want to ask you is this. If you were to put a small piece of food on a cloth by your door tonight, on whatever serves you as a threshold, and if you were to check in the morning whether the cloth was folded, you would know something. I am not going to tell you what you would know. I am not sure telling it changes it, but I am going to say that I checked the morning after I drove up to the mouth of Trace Creek Hollow and sat with the window down and came home. I checked because I had been in the air of that place, even at the edge of it, even at the road, and I had read everything, and I wanted to know. I put a piece of bread on a cloth on my back step. I went to bed. I came out in the morning. The bread was gone. The cloth was smooth, not folded. Just smooth, the way a cloth is when a wind has moved it or a creature has nosed at it and the bread has fallen somewhere in the grass. I stood there in the morning, and I breathed in, and I smelled the morning, and I told myself the bread had blown off or an animal had gotten it, and I had no reason to do anything differently than I had done yesterday. And I went inside, and I ate breakfast, and I went on with my day. And I have put bread on the step every night for 9 months now. Not every night, most nights. And I check in the morning, and the cloth is always smooth. I am telling you that so you know where I am in this. Not outside the account. Not the calm person with the research and the careful attribution. In it, on a specific side of the door, at a specific threshold, in a specific morning light, checking. The cloth is always smooth. I choose to believe that means I am clean. You may believe what you choose about it, but I want you, tonight, after this, to check your thresholds, not because I think the hollow came through the speakers at you, not because I think the knowing is the same as being in the air of it, but because I think that in a world where something cut a basin in the east wall of a hollow in Kentucky before there was a Harlan County, in a world where a woman kept the plate at the door for 30 years, alone in the dark, and the cloth was always folded. In that world, the checking is not superstition. The checking is the only thing that tells you which side of the door you are on. And knowing which side of the door you are on is the oldest piece of the instruction, older than patience, and older than pole combs, and older than the first agreement. And it is the piece that was never lost, because it is the piece you do not need to be taught. You already know. You have always known. That is why you are watching this in the dark. If you have ever put food out and found it gone in the morning, if you have ever found yourself doing something at a threshold without knowing why, if you have ever smelled copper in a room where there was no copper, tell me about it in the comments. I want to know. I want to know how far this reaches. There is a next case. It is another hollow, another family, another record that should not exist but does. When it is ready, if you are subscribed, it will find you. Until then, check your step in the morning, and keep the cloth where you can see it. One last thing. This case has more paper behind it than most I have covered. If you want to know which box to ask for in the Harlan County Courthouse basement, ask for Box 4. The finding aid calls it Land Records, 1840 to 1860. That is not all that is in it. The woman at the front desk has been asked before. She will know why you are there. What you find is between you and what is in that east wall.